I think John's getting back to you. Oh, okay. So we'll find out. You'll be in there. I think it's been a good mission. Good.
Just record it? Yeah.
Right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Andres Rengifo, and I'm a faculty member here at Rutgers in the School of Criminal Justice. It's a great pleasure to welcome you now officially. Yesterday we did a little bit of informal welcoming to our first workshop on measures and meanings of crime and justice in the Global South. Again, that's a very long title. There's lots to talk about. Maybe that's what we do. And I'm here to really thank people for all the work and love put into this, to our guest participants traveling and for sharing your time with us during the next 2 or 3 days, your expertise, your openness to share your experience and ask questions. So hoping that we'll do more on the questions than usual. And also to thank the university and to thank the school and our dean, who I'll introduce in a second, for supporting this work. It's very nice to see a full project cycle here at Rutgers, meaning that the funding for this conference is attached to funding that allowed primary data collection in several countries, funding that allowed students to travel and to learn new methodologies, and for us to also engage in a conversation about what it is to do scholarship outside of the US and in the Global South, starting with Latin America. So it's great for us to be able to share that experience and to bring together some of you that I've met in your home countries and who help us do this work. So thank you for that. Also want to thank a number of PhD students here at Rutgers and at other universities who are helping us run the local committee for the conference. Again, from the streaming to the folders to the coffee breaks to the hotel reservations. So you guys have been amazing, and again, I'm very proud to see you do all of this, and hope we can run more things in the future. And finally, to thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and Lorena for their support of the work and of this workshop. So to our public and allies and people in the audience, again, thank you for coming. This conference is going to be webcast today, also recorded and put on YouTube. We have folders, the media release forms there that I'm hoping you will be able to read and sign. And the presentations will be stored again on YouTube and kept there for the for the foreseeable future. So I don't know if that's scary or not, but I think that's a good thing in general. As we try to engage an audience that's beyond the one here. As I mentioned to several of you, the presentations, most of them will be in English, but we will also have presentations in Portuguese and Spanish. So the slides will be in English, so you will be able to follow. And there are the abstracts also on the website in English. And of course, we can also run some form of translation or interpretation if it's needed at any point. So, but again, most of the presentations we hope to have in English. Okay, with that, again, I want to thank also the staff at the School of Criminal Justice who helped us set this up, who helped with your flights and hotels, and who also helped us put together the logistics of the event. Again, this is a collective effort, and I think it's lovely to see it come together. So with that in mind, again, I want to introduce you to our dean, Professor Rod Brunson, who is an old friend. We met a long time ago at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and we are here now. And again, I'm very happy that you can be here for us and get us started.
So I would like to add my welcome, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you not only to Rutgers University Newark, but also the School of Criminal Justice. One of the dangerous things to give an administrative person the microphone and time. So I know that's something that is not done very lightly, but I will certainly be respectful of your time and attention. I will also say that Andreas told me yesterday that you all had a soft opening. And I'm trying not to look at people to see how soft it was for some people, how hard it was for others. No judgment. I've been there as well. But I will say, one of the pleasures of being dean is to have faculty that identify problems, issues, gaps, and shortcomings, and are not only willing to identify those, because there are plenty of people who are willing to identify them. But I say this in all sincerity, that Andreas is a person who finds solutions. And I think that you all will find over the next few days, and I looked at the agenda, and my regret is that I can't attend all of the sessions, but it certainly is something that will increase the school's visibility and reputation, and I'm certainly grateful that Andreas made this huge sacrifice of time, energy, and effort to put this together. So welcome. I look forward to meeting some of you and re-meeting others, and I hope that you have a great program. Thank you.
Well, it is a real pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Lorena Avila. I come in representation of the Rule of Law program for Latin America of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Since the very first moment that Andres shared this idea with me and a group of colleagues that are doing some work on these issues, I was very excited, and I really thought it was a great idea to be present in these type of discussions that are moving not only America, but the whole continent and the whole globe. And that was the reason why I thought, okay, we are talking about Global South, and Latin America has been, of course, very present in here. And we're doing very interesting things, and we're thinking very interesting things. And this has to be a space for us to visualize and socialize and learn from each other what we're doing, how we're doing it, and strengthen our own approaches and see how we can learn from each other. For me, it is very, very special that this is a very gender equal audience without having to think so hard about it. And that for me is a real pleasure to share this feeling of, yeah, we can do this. And that's the point where we have to go, and that's very, very nice. And the Rule of program for Latin America has very specific objectives, where the institutional strengthening is one of them, and the division of power, trying to fight and construct on it is very important, specifically in the judicial part, specifically in times like this. And you know better than I what I'm talking about. Another specific goal for our work is to protect and defend not only but materially, but also processing the human rights and human rights law. And of course, the final objective will be leading to regional integration. And that's why we're all here. That's why these kind of spaces is so important for us, and we hope to be able to keep, I don't know if sponsoring is the right word, but maybe being participative and very active in this kind of debates. And thanks to Rutgers University, Andres, and all the guys that have been working behind the curtains. We say, is that an expression in English for it? But thank you very much. Thanks for having me here, and I wish you all the best for these sessions that I'm pretty sure will be the most productive ones. Thank you very much.
So we're going to get started. Just a final word on the program. Again, you have it in your folders and also online. The sessions today are about measures. So we are trying to challenge the idea of the South as a data poor environment, something that cannot be explored or cannot be explored on its margins. So part of what we try to do today is not to focus on specific crime like human trafficking or drugs or cross-borders corruption. That's those more typical, I think, conventional ways to think about comparative work or international work. But thinking about measures, right? So how are people trying to generate knowledge outside of the core or outside of the global south, or the global north? So that's why we're thinking about expanding notions of scholarship. That meant yesterday, for example, having a great conversation about filmmaking, but again, thinking about how we do this work outside, not only of academia, but again, outside of that global north, in terms of methods and measures, but also in terms of theory. And so tomorrow we'll be doing more thinking about concepts and ideas. Again, to our link measures and meanings, but again, trying to split them a little bit across methods today and across perspectives tomorrow. So have fun, and we're going to get started with our first panel on observations.
So, like Andres mentioned, welcome to the first panel, the first annual meeting of meanings and measures of crime and justice in the Global South. The first panel will be solely focused on observations. I should probably introduce myself. I am Luis Torres. I am a second-year PhD student from the University of Missouri in St. Louis. I am myself very excited to hear what the panelists here have to say and throughout the entire workshop. Each speaker will have approximately 15 minutes, and at the end we'll have a 20-minute Q&A. Our first presenter today is Rodrigo Dirangelli, good, who is currently a professor at Pontifical Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul. Our second presenter is Ana Aguilar, who is the founder and director of projects of El Instituto de Justicia Procesal Penal, and for those who don't speak Spanish, it is the Institute of Criminal Justice, Procedural Justice. Institute of Criminal Procedural Justice. And third, Michael Adevallo, who is currently a professor here at the School of Criminal Justice, will speak third. And finally, Rachel Foran, who is the managing director of Brooklyn, will go last, fourth and last. So without further ado,
Okay, good morning, buenos días. Andrés me autorizó a hablar en portugués, porque para mí es más tranquilo, pero voy a tentar de alguna forma trazer algunas cosas también en español, en inglés, para facilitar la comunicación con ustedes, ¿ok? Si alguien tiene alguna duda, por favor, puede preguntar también. Esta apresentação que farei aqui, fiz também na Argentina. Máximo Sosso me convidou para um seminário em Santa Fé, quando apresentamos esta pesquisa sobre as audiências de custódia em Brasil, a implementação de custody hearings em Brasil, que foi um mecanismo para que os presos fossem apresentados ao juez logo ao princípio do processo. Quando a prisão acontece, têm então agora que em 24 horas apresentar o preso ao juez. Esta é uma novidade no Brasil que não havia. Vou começar apresentando o contexto da situação no Brasil em termos de encarceramento. Vejam que o Brasil, dos 4 países que mais encarceram no mundo, é hoje o único onde há crescimento das taxas de encarceramento. Um crescimento bastante significativo. Aqui temos Estados Unidos, menos 10, China, menos 10, a Rússia, menos 25, e o Brasil, um crescimento de uma variação, né, de quase 35% no período que vai de 2008 a 2014. Então é uma situação que torna o Brasil hoje talvez o país onde mais se utiliza a prisão e cresce a utilização da prisão no contexto de grandes taxas de encarceramento, que já é o contexto brasileiro. Aqui se pode ver que de dezembro de 2014 a junho de 2016, a taxa de encarceramento no Brasil cresce de 306 presos por 100 mil habitantes para 355 presos a cada 100 mil habitantes. A taxa de ocupação, o número de presos por vaga no sistema, vai de 165% a 185%, ou seja, temos hoje em Brasil quase 2 presos a cada espaço em prisão. Há 350 mil vagas e 700 mil presos. Esta é a situação em Brasil, e piorando ao longo do tempo. Uma comparação rápida em termos internacionais mostra que Brasil tem hoje 700 mil, já tem mais que isso. 37% são os presos sem condena, os presos provisórios. Presos provisionais são 37%, já são 40%. Vejam que México tem uma situação parecida, nos Estados Unidos são 20%, em Rússia 17%, na China não há essa informação, e na Tailândia 20%, e a Índia com uma situação pior de 67% de presos provisórios. Brasil tem, portanto, uma situação que é similar a México e um pouco melhor que Índia em termos de presos provisionais. Que é o grande tema? 40% de presos provisórios em Brasil. Como se lida com isso? Como se pode alterar isso? Como se pode fazer algo para modificar este quadro? Vejam que do total de presos provisórios em Brasil, 29% são ligados a crimes praticados em torno do mercado da droga, tráfico de drogas, porte de drogas, auxílio para uso de drogas. 30% praticamente de todos os presos provisórios, que é mais ou menos a mesma taxa do sistema como um todo. 30% hoje em Brasil de presos ligados ao tema da droga. 26% roubo, como disse em inglês?
Robbery.
Robbery, yeah. 26%. Homicídios, 13%. E o Brasil é um país que tem hoje taxas, uma situação de 60.000 mortos al año por homicídio, pero não há muitos presos por homicídio, porque a taxa de esclarecimento é muito baixa. Temos muito poucas condenas por homicídio no Brasil. E depois, outros crimes. Estes três são os que predominam e com grande maioria de casos de presos por tráfico de drogas. Também o Brasil, claro, tem uma situação muito diversa em termos regionais. O Brasil tem, todos estes são províncias, são estados em Brasil, e vejam que em Sergipe há 80% de presos provisórios no sistema. Alagoas, 80%. Ceará, 66%. Bahia, 59%. Todos os estados da região nordeste do Brasil. Enquanto que São Paulo, que tem um grande número de presos, o estado que é mais populoso e que tem mais presos, no entanto, tem apenas 15% de presos provisionais, um número bastante menos significativo que outros estados. O tempo médio de prisão em Brasil varia também muito. Vean que em Pernambuco isto é para a prisão provisional. Em Pernambuco a média é 1.000 dias em prisão provisional. Pretrial detention, yeah. 1.000 dias em pretrial. Rio Grande do Norte, 682. Minas Gerais, 660. São os estados que têm o maior tempo de encarcelamento provisional, pretrial detention. E com mais de 180 dias de custódia, de pretrial detention, Minas também, Minas Gerais, São Paulo, aqui aparece, com um grande número de presos com mais de 180 dias, Rio Grande do Sul, Rio de Janeiro. São os estados mais populosos e que têm também o maior número de presos em pretrial detention. Uma outra questão que as audiências de custódia procuraram enfrentar além da prisão provisória é a violência da polícia. Muitos casos de prisões que ocorrem no Brasil, há violência por las polícias. E vejam que esta situação tem empeorado nos últimos anos. O Brasil tinha, em 2012, 2013, 2.200 muertes praticadas por polícias ao ano. Police killings ao ano. Police killings ao ano, in 1 year in Brazil, 2.200. Agora temos, em 2017, 5.100. 5,100 muertes praticadas por polícias. Vejam, 2.200, 5.100, em um período muito curto. Samira, que está aqui, vai falar por el Foro Brasileiro de Seguridade Pública, a última a falar no workshop, também irá tratar disso, especificamente do tema da violência da polícia. E então, o Conselho Nacional de Justiça, National Council of Justice em Brasil, cria as audiências de custódia para, de alguma forma, tentar alterar esta situação em termos de prisões provisionais, pretrial detention e police violence. As audiências foram implementadas no ano de 2015, um projeto piloto em São Paulo e depois em outros estados também. Para que este é, no período, o presidente da Suprema Corte, que também é o presidente do Council of Justice, e claramente declara: custody hearings serve to avoid the unnecessary incarceration of persons who, even if they have committed crimes, should not remain in prison during the proceedings. Moreover, they already indicate that there are notorious mechanisms to protect the physical and moral integrity of prisoners, curbing practices of torture, and that consolidate the right to access to justice, due process, and ample defense from the initial moment of criminal prosecution. Esta é declaradamente o objetivo, a ideia das audiências de custódia. Então, realizamos uma pesquisa, a research, to the Council of Justice, en el año de 2017, también sob la coordenación del Foro Brasileño de Seguridad Pública, que realizou este trabalho. E temos, então, alguns dados sobre isso, sobre as audiências de custódia. Trabalhamos com 6 capitais dos estados de La Paraíba, Tocantins, Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, São Paulo e Distrito Federal. Vemos que em todos esses estados há crescimento do número de prisões provisionais, pretrial detention, mesmo com as audiências de custódia. Paraíba vai de 39, 40 para 42. Tocantins de 37 para 39, Rio Grande do Sul 34 38, Santa Catarina 23 para 36, São Paulo 29 32 e em Brasília de 21 para 24. Aqui alguns dados generais sobre as audiências em Brasil. Hasta de 2015 hasta 2017 são 230.000 audiências. Em estas, em 45% o resultado é a liberação do acusado e em 54% se mantêm as prisões. Casos de violência da polícia registrados são 4,8%, embora a pesquisa mostre que há muito mais casos que não são registrados nas audiências. Estes são dados generais do sistema. E então observamos audiências nestas 6 capitais: São Paulo, Brasília, Porto Alegre, João Pessoa, Florianópolis e Palmas. E aqui estão os resultados. Vejam que o perfil dos presos apresentados nas audiências, 90% são homens, 65% são pretos ou pardos, como se diz em Brasil, são black people, 51% com antecedentes criminais, não sei se diz background. Criminal records, yeah. 51% with criminal records. Os principais delitos de indiciamento em las audiencias são também roubo, furto e tráfico de drogas. El furto, robbery and theft, and traffic. Os 3 drugs, yeah, os 3 que mais têm casos. Em termos de age groups, vejam que a grande maioria são jovens, com 18, 19, 20 anos de idade. E cruzando o dado de idade com color, race, vejam que a grande maioria são black people and young people. A grande maioria dos casos de los presos que são levados às audiências. Vejam que em las audiências 22% mention violence, enquanto que em los dados do Conselho apenas 4%, pero em las audiências 22%, em las audiências que observamos nós outros. E a grande maioria dos casos a violência é praticada por las polícias militares, que são polícias estaduais com caráter militar e que fazem o policiamento ostensivo. Aqui o percentual sobre cor e raça das decisões que conviertem a prisão em pretrial detention em las audiências. Vejam que não há muita diferença no sentido de que praticamente em metade dos casos se mantiene la prisión y en mitad de los casos son liberados mediante otras posibilidades cautelares, como encaminamiento para asistencia y otras situaciones que también ocurren. Aquí están las precautionary measure applied: comparecimiento periódico, recolhimento noturno, prohibición de ausencia en comarca y fianza. Son las alternativas a la prisión pretrial, detention, aplicadas en el sistema en Brasil. E vejam, estas alternativas foram criadas para reduzir o encarceramento provisional, reduzir as pretrial detention. No entanto, não afetaram as estatísticas. Ou seja, são aplicadas para quem antes não ficava em prisão e agora recebe uma medida cautelar. Uma discussão muito antiga na criminologia de que as alternativas penais acabam não afetando o encarceramento e sim criando novas modalidades de controle para quem não ficava no cárcere. Em Brasil ocorre o mesmo. E, portanto, it was not possible to perceive the intent breach of the binomial arrest in flagrant preventive detention, and pretrial detention is applied on a daily basis, often without the verification of alternative measures and in disrespect of fundamental guarantees such as legality, presumption of innocence, proportionality, due process of law, and its reasonable duration. This is a general conclusion about this pesquisa. E para concluir, não é possível tratar da questão do sistema penal e da democracia em Brasil hoje sem falar da situação política. Estamos em uma situação política muito grave, teremos a possibilidade muito concreta de la eleição em segundo turno agora, no dia 28 de outubro, de político que todos conhecem, aqui está em liberação, mas em toda a mídia mundial se trata deste indivíduo hoje, que é fascista, conhecido, que defende a tortura, que defende a ditadura, que é homofóbico, racista, misógino, e, no entanto, tem hoje em Brasil grande apoio popular e poderá, se ganhar as eleições. Já temos algumas pesquisas de segundo turno, como disse, segunda volta, sim, que dão a ele 55% de apoio contra 45% de Fernando Haddad, que é o candidato do Partido dos Trabalhadores, um partido social-demócrata, que tem hoje muita rejeição popular construída por la mídia, por situações e problemas ocorridos em los governos de Lula e Dilma, e que, apesar de todo, foi hasta a segunda volta. Talvez tivesse sido melhor outro partido, outro candidato, com apoio de Lula. No entanto, Lula optou por defender seu candidato do partido e teve sucesso, está em la segunda volta, pero com uma grande possibilidade de ser derrotado por Bolsonaro, e isto irá tornar a situação em Brasil muito grave. Teremos claramente que contar hoje com o apoio internacional de vocês que estejam olhando para o Brasil, porque já há crescimento da violência, como viram, de 14 até 17, de 2.000 para 5.000 mortes praticadas por la policía. Bolsonaro é o candidato da polícia, das polícias que são contra os direitos humanos, que são contra todo o que se tentou fazer em Brasil durante 30 anos, de 88 até agora, para consolidar ou construir em Brasil um Estado democrático de direito, com todas as dificuldades que temos em Brasil para isso. Se Bolsonaro ganha, e já tem, mesmo que não obtivesse a vitória, o Congresso em Brasil tem agora uma composição também muito triste, com muitos defensores da tortura, contrários aos direitos humanos, contrários a todo o que de alguma forma estamos trabalhando para construir em Brasil nesses 30 anos. Então, todo o debate em Brasil se altera. O que se tentava fazer agora será interrompido e não terá uma possibilidade de reversão a curto e médio prazo se não temos uma grande possibilidade de construção em nível internacional, incluso de apoio e de denúncia da situação que estamos prestes a vivenciar em Brasil. Muitas graças.
Ana?
Buenos días. Good morning. I'm Ana Villar, as Luis already said. And I'm going to try to make the presentation in English, so I have my presentation written also if I don't do it really well. We've been working with Andres and his team on court observations in Mexico. He once came and said, you know, we want to do this, and we were like, oh, we are doing this since some time ago. And so I'm going to speak about the challenges and opportunities that this kind of method brings to the very, not so recently, but the ongoing criminal justice reform in Mexico. So a little bit of background before on this reform. We're a very particular country in Latin America. We never had a dictatorship, actually. But we did have a transition because we were ruled for one single party for 81 years. So that's very much a kind of dictatorship. We never had fair and free elections until 2000. So these intentions of reform came with this transition. And of course it was part of the wave in the region of transforming the criminal justice system from being very authoritarian. We had that kind of system. We had the written system in Mexico, but overall we had a very human rights against system in a sense. There were systematic violations during the proceedings. For instance, people could be in pretrial detention for years. So far, up until today, we have people that have been in pretrial detention in the old system for 15 years. So one of the things that we tried to change with this reform was that. And actually we did it, at least in the norms, very well. We have a period or people cannot be held in pretrial detention for over 2 years. So if the proceedings go on or the people have to be released on the other kind of measure and so on, which I mean, considering that we had people for 5-10 years in pretrial detention before, this is a really good advance. So this was a liberalization and democratization period. We had certainly more rights and freedoms. And one of these, this period also was characterized by more political participation from different sectors. A more empowered civil society, academics that were able to do a lot of studies and statistical studies, not so many, but the few information that was produced during this period helped to give evidence to the authorities that the criminal justice reform had to be reformed. The criminal justice had to be reformed. So we introduced adversarial features, as we did all in Latin America or in many countries. And one of the main features that help the court observations are orality of the hearings and publicity. We did have the hearings since the beginning, unlike Brazil, which when I got to know the system of Brazil, I was very surprised that this didn't happen, because we started with that. In the old system, we didn't have it either. So I know how the change should work. So what about the method of court hearing observation? Well, it's privilege window. For those who have done it, you know that you get to see a lot, that you get to see not only the good and bad practices, but also some sort of topics and issues that you don't get to see when you are just litigating, focusing on your activity during the hearing if you're a lawyer or if you're the prosecutor. But when you are the public in the hearings, you have a very privileged spot because you get to see the attitudes of the parties, the suffering also of the victims, the suffering also of the defendants because, you know, they suffer a lot there. And I will tell you later on why. It's also limited spectrum, and we have received criticism on this kind of method because they say, well, it doesn't help to know the structural problems or the relationship of the agents of the system with their structures. And a number of times the bad practices come from that relationship, from the lack of independence, from the judges or from the defenders, or the pressures on the prosecutions. But it certainly gives hints, because when you are there and you start to be more trained to see and to watch what the actors do, you get to see that also you can have hints of these structural problems. It's costly, you know, so mobilize people to watch hearings, it's very costly. And it's particularly costly because there's no incentive in the institutions to be measured and to be evaluated. So a number of times also the information that you produce through this method gets or stalls or stays petrified. There's, you know, sometimes institutions say, oh yeah, welcome to the hearings, but then they don't use the information at all that we provide. And this also doesn't help that whenever we want to put this kind of method in our projects, I come from a civil society organization, the funding is also, you know, they are a little bit skeptic about this kind of measuring. So we try. But it's difficult to make the donors understand why we want to do this and we want to keep doing this. So now, well, it certainly measures quality of justice, for sure. If you develop an instrument that actually tries to find how the actors should litigate based on the norms and so on, you can measure quality very well. So I'm going to show you now some examples of the things that we have produced and the findings that we have done with this method. So what we measure is from the access to the hearing, because that's something that is very important in terms of publicity, to the adjudication or the specific resolution. We started measuring something that we call the initial hearings. And the initial hearing compounds more or less 5 different procedural decisions. So first of all, we see with something that we call the legality control or control de detention, which is the moment where the judge has to decide whether the personal liberty of a person was restricted in a constitutional manner. So that's the first decision. Then a decision, it's not really a decision, but the next moment is about, it's more or less like an indictment, you know, when you inform the person why is there. Then we have a very particular moment, which we call vinculación a proceso, when you decide whether there's a merit in the case and you can proceed with the proceedings. In Latin America, it's some sort of supuesto material just before the bail hearing. Then we have the bail moment. And then we have a moment where the parties decide how much time they need to investigate more on the case. So that's initial hearing. And that's the one we actually observe, because a number of fundamental rights are at stake in this particular hearing. So on publicity. This is actually very interesting because we found very different practices, like practices of almost unrestricted access to the courts, which is really good. But then we have found like very ridiculous practices, I have to say, on this. And it's not about that they restrict your entrance in a way like you don't get in, but they put a lot of obstacles to get in. So I'm going to tell you once something that we found in one jurisdiction. So in one of the cities that we observed, you can enter the hearing, but you can enter the hearing without backpacks, without purses, without cell phones, and they don't have a place to leave your things. So what happened with this is that there's an informal business outside the court with a person that charges you to leave your things there. And then inside the hearings, what we have seen is that, well, the court is, like property of the judge. So the judge decides what to do there. Some judges don't let you sit next to someone, so you have to say, I don't know how to say this, but one chair can be occupied, the next one not, and then the next one yes, and things like that. Sometimes they come and say, you don't move, because then the judge will be angry with you and you will be expelled from the court. But then there are very good practices also in some states, and you can just go inside the courtroom and you will be fine. One of the things that it's been very important for us is also to measure the language of the actors, particularly of the judges. So, because with orality, supposedly, it comes also like a more understandable language for the parties, especially for the parties, victim and defendant. But this didn't really happen in Mexico. So we believe it's like a first condition to access justice. And if this doesn't happen, then the parties, stay the same as the system was written. So, well, it's not surprising that still we have hearings with non-understandable language from the actors, the professionals. And the worst part of this is that reading is the rule. So this is something that has happened, especially in the states that enforced the reform more recently. The parties are not really well trained. The lawyers are not. So we've seen also the prosecutor and the defender dictating the judge what they are saying, actually what they are reading. And the judge, a number of times, is not only writing in a laptop there, so not putting attention, not to the parties, not to the whole hearing in general. So these are very, very bad practices, but also we have very good judges that actually try to explain and to be more understandable for the parties. Well, pretrial detention, of course. We started to do the court observation with pretrial or bail hearings. So this allows us to measure one type of indicator, which is exceptionality. And I think Todd knows about that a lot. And depending on the jurisdiction, we've seen up to 90% of people remanded. So this allows us also to, I don't know if contrast, but let's see, to contrast with the traditional indicators of people in prison, percentage of people in prison, or the rate of people in pretrial detention. It's just a different indicator, but it shows a lot, because if you see the type of crime that they are being tried for, it's also usually very minor. If we have a big problem in Mexico with impunity, we have like this black figure, it's very high, it's over more or less at about 94%. And so the grave offenses are never in the courts. This is the problem. Of course, it's more complicated than that, but pretrial detention keeps being a problem in Mexico, although if you see, for instance, the people in prison, in contrast with people convicted, then you have a lower percentage than in the old system. Now it's about, as Rodrigo said, about 38, 39%. In the states, in the federal level, it's about 50%. So That's still very high. And the 90% actually came from these observations in one of the jurisdictions, which is the state of Mexico. It's a state next to Mexico City. And we saw, and this is something that I want to mention because our more recent report was about pretrial detention and effective defense. We used the Inter-American standard that said that the defense has to be articulated during the hearing and the argumentation has to be quality argumentation. So we measured that, and in the state of Mexico, we saw first that the prosecutors request pretrial detention almost in 100% of the cases, and almost in 100% of the cases they get pretrial detention. But what we saw is that defenders, well, they might not be there. They might not be there. I mean, their presence there is not relevant. So this is a very particular jurisdiction actually. The state of Mexico, it's not the best, I have to say. So we found that in this very recent report. Another finding here, but it's more recent and we're trying to figure out what to do with this, but it's judicial management. It seems like the way the courts schedule the hearings are affecting not only the continuity and the concentration principles of the system, which means that everything has to be, or most of it, resolved in the same hearing. But we've seen, for instance, in one of the jurisdictions that this combines in a very bad way with the lack of resources of the public defenders, for instance. So the way they schedule the hearings make the defenders to request deferrals of the hearings, to go to another hearing, and that sometimes means that the person of the first hearing has to remain in pretrial detention for days because of our system and the way it works. So this is really affecting some fundamental rights, but also we've seen hearings, for instance, or when we were in the courts in one of the jurisdictions as well, we discovered that the same judge has two hearings at the same time. So he starts one hearing, defers, and then he goes to the other hearing, starts it, suspends, and goes back to the first one. That's very weird. And then this information was confirmed, we thought, because we thought it was like the vacations period of the court. But then we confirmed it with some defenders that it's actually happening all the time. So that's a problem. And about opportunities, in many senses, thanks to the work that we did with Andres and the team on the instrument of observations, we were, I think we had the opportunity to see the socioeconomic background of the defendants in a clearer way. This is something that it seems like it's intuitive that the people in a more vulnerable position, economic position, is the one that gets to the system. But we haven't measured really. There are some measures on the people in, of course, in prison. But then from the hearings, you can see a lot of things. For instance, the color of the skin. And that's something that in Mexico we haven't measured ever. But now there's a public agency on statistics, specializing in statistics, very recently launched a report on economic income, on income and the color of skin for the first time in Mexico. So I think there is a great opportunity also to do some kind of measures here with this method. The gender perspective, we have more like anecdotal evidence on this. The women are very residually represented in the system, but they usually are, because of that, they are more excluded in many senses from the rights that they deserve. And we've seen, particularly in bail hearings, a lot of stereotypes against women, like you're not good, you're not a good mother, that's why you're going to prison, like the judges say that kind of things. And of course the attitudes of the criminal justice professionals that it's very difficult to measure this, but we've seen a lot of suspicious attitudes, between the judges, the prosecutors, and the defenders, and corruption shows sometimes, although of course this cannot be measured. But that's something that we can see in this type of hearing. So what I can tell you is that although it's a limited method to do things, from all these examples that I gave you, we always get new ideas and new projects, and we have done some interventions based on these hearings. Basically, for instance, about the democratic language of judges, we launched a guide on hearing conduction in preliminary hearings, and actually we have held some workshops with judges to train them on how to be more, or how to make their language more understandable for defendants and for victims. We have done some studies on the exceptionality of pretrial detention, as I mentioned, and the most recent study is this one on pretrial detention and effective defense, which is about the importance of the defense attorneys in this type of hearing. So thank you very much. This has been our experience and the challenges and opportunities of this kind of method. Thank you.
We have Dr. Adovello next.
Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. My name is Michael Sierra Arevalo. I'm an assistant professor here in the School of Criminal Justice. I'm going to forego the mic. I'm just going to try and talk loudly as best I can. There's going to be sections in English. I'll be reading some Mexican legislation in Spanish and translating as we go. If there's any questions at all, please feel free to stop me. I'm happy to clarify at any moment. Wait for it. I can begin giving the background. So this is an ethnographic project based off, or more of a complement to my ethnographic research here in the United States with 3 urban police departments. This is an international analog to this work, based off of 2 months of field work in Ciudad Mexico, specifically in the center of Mexico City for the most part. The first month of that field work was largely spent unsuccessfully gaining access to a police car in Mexico City. It allowed me a lot of time to observe protests, to observe order maintenance policing, to go and observe the various groups that use Mexico City as a platform to engage in political protests and the role of police in controlling those types of protests. The second month was spent embedded, you can hit F11, that should full screen it. Was spent in a police car with the Metropolitan Police. The Metropolitan Police, as I'll describe in a moment, are not the same thing as the preventative police. So these are not police officers that are taking calls for service. These are ipso facto mobile SWAT units that do everything from do flood control, crowd control, proactive policing, order maintenance policing, and everything else in between. They are part of the Secretaría de Seguridad Pública, the SSP, which is part of the massive, approximately 45,000 police officer unit that spreads across. That's just the Metro Police Department. So, with me ad-libbing the introduction, in the years since the events of Ferguson, the operations, the culture, the consequences of US policing have been thrust to the center stage of popular political and academic debate in the role and the misuse of state agents in civil life. And this is very much the intellectual and historical background which my work in Mexico City is taking place against. My work began here in the United States thinking about the role of police and how that can affect the legitimacy of not only police themselves, but the state more broadly. Police, of course, being the most public and most contacted agents of the criminal justice system, not only in the US, but in most countries. Following Ferguson and other highly publicized police killings, such as that of Eric Garner and Tamir Rice, President Obama convened the 21st Century Task Force on Policing, which emphasized the crisis of legitimacy currently facing US law enforcement. The task force's final report emphasize the need for police strategies that counteract distrust and enhance legitimacy. Tom Tyler defining this legitimacy as the property of an authority or institution that leads people to feel that authority or an institution is entitled to be deferred to and obeyed. As now nearly 30 years of research on legitimacy shows, perceptions of legitimacy and legal legitimacy more broadly are strongly tied to citizens' perceptions of the degree to which police A, make decisions fairly, and B, treat people fairly. The public desires police that will give their side of the story, even if they are eventually punished, that are neutral and unbiased, and that treat citizens with dignity and respect. Of course, though it might be easy to focus solely on instances like Ferguson, in situations like it that affect the legitimacy of US police, especially when working in a field dominated by US scholars and by US institutions, the causes and consequences of a lack of police legitimacy are neither restricted to, nor even at their most dire in the United States. Case in point, Mexico struggles with levels of public distrust that make the crisis of legitimacy in the US pale in comparison. For example, while a more than 20-year low of support for US police has already bounced back to long-standing averages of over half the population having a great deal of, or quite a lot of confidence in the police, the Mexican public has grown less trusting of police over time. This figure is produced by the Instituto Nacional de Estadística y Geografía that administers the NVIPE survey, which focuses on victimization and the perception of public safety. It shows citizen perceptions of societal trust in various state institutions here on the left, and perceptions of corruption among these same institutions on the right. In contrast to the Navy and the Army, which are generally viewed by people as being trusted by society at large, those are the, does this work? The two columns on the top, Marina and Ejército, and on the right, Marina and Ejército, they are viewed as being very trusted by society. On the right, only 20% and 27% respectively believe that these institutions are corrupt. In comparison, 51% of the population believes that preventative police are trusted by Mexican society, meaning that half of them believe that it's not trusted. And then the transit police, these are the ones that are notorious for taking bribes for traffic tickets. About 56% of the Mexican public believes that these institutions are not trusted. By comparison, you can see that 77% of the Mexican public believes that traffic police are corrupt. Similarly, 68% believe that local municipal police, preventative police, are corrupt. This, of course, coincides with historically high levels of violence in Mexico, all after more than 30 years of police reform that, though laudable for creating a national level criminal code, judicial reform, and a broad framework for police reform, one analyst summarized simply as, quote, manic creation and disappearances of agencies. Indeed, as noted by Maureen Meyer of the Washington Office on Latin America, in spite of multiple efforts, Mexican police forces continue to be abusive and corrupt. Indeed, little in decades of criminal justice reform directly addresses the street-level behavior of police officers that are tasked with maintaining order and enforcing the law. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, rising violence and a lack of substantive change in police practice insofar as interactions with citizens are concerned leaves the public trust in Mexican police at its current rock-bottom levels. Though state corruption, brutality, and incompetence certainly play a part in widespread distrust of Mexican police, the jarring state malfeasance and investigatory incompetence exemplified by events such as the 2014 quote-unquote disappearance of 43 student protesters from Migala, though tragic, says little of the daily interactions with police officers that represent the most visible and contacted agents of social control. As such, those stories of traffic officers accepting bribes and general corruption are ubiquitous and indicative of general distrust and the long-standing illegitimacy of police. The daily operations of local officers tasked with ensuring security and public safety are largely understudied and not largely understood. By extension, the iterative, commonplace action of police officers that perpetuates the deep rift between police and public in Mexico are largely uninvestigated. To elucidate these daily street-level behaviors that shape public perception of police, I spent 2 months in Mexico City learning about and observing the activities of the Metropolitan Police, known also as La Policía Metropolitana, or simply La Metro, or Metro. During my first month in the field, I was unsuccessful, as I mentioned before, but I did observe police operating in their various roles, crowd control, helping out with traffic depending on the situation, In the second month, in the summer, is when I did become embedded in one unit, one squad, which usually operated in convoy throughout the entirety of Mexico City. There is no one district where the Metro unit will work. They have full reign of the entire city and they go where they are needed. Again, much like a mobile SWAT team. They carry rifles, they don't just carry pistols, full Kevlar helmets that you'll see in photos that I'll show you in a moment. During this latter month of observation, I rode along with Metro officers for anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. This actually only comprises 1/3 to 1/2 of their 24-hour shifts. That is illegal here in the United States. It is not illegal in Mexico to be a 24-hour shift patrol officer. Unlike the Policía Sector, where the sector police Metro officers are not chained to the radio. They do not take 911 calls. Instead, they function as roving jack-of-all-trades officers that engage in proactive car stops, walking stops, searches, tactical entries and operations, crowd control, disaster relief, prisoner transport, and myriad other tasks in between. I'm happy to talk about the full range of activities. I'm not covering the crowd control. I'm not covering how they deal with fires. I'm not covering how they do any of those other things. I'm focusing today on the street-level activities that echo the stop and frisk and Terry-style stops that are known here in the United States to negatively affect police legitimacy and trust in government more broadly. If it wasn't clear, I'm the guy that's wearing the red hat. So, moving on to analysis. My time with Metro officers was spent largely in convoys like this one, though usually only 2 trucks of rifle-wielding officers bedecked in body armor, tactical gloves, and ballistic helmets, plus a motorcycle unit comprised the convoy. On this particular day, the convoy was upgraded to 3 trucks because we were going into a, quote, zona pesada, or a zona dura, a heavy or a hard zone, that officers said was characterized by high crime and high violence. Officers frequently spoke of the possibility of ambush in such areas as justification for the increased show of force, though I suspect having a U.S. national attached to an elite U.S. institution also contributed to their need or desire to have more guns. Thankfully, no officers were ever assaulted or ambushed during my hours riding around on patrol again. While driving around, Jefe Gomez, he was the commanding officer of the convoy, would periodically call out to his motorcycle unit over the radio, things like, "La roja, Pancho, la roja, the red one, Pancho, the red one." The motor unit would cut off the car in question, the convoy would catch up, and anywhere from 4 to 8 officers would pile out of the truck to surround the stopped vehicle, with rifles at the ready, not pointed at them, but very conspicuously placed across their chest. An officer would then approach the car and then tell the driver that they were doing an inspection, and if they minded if they took a look, they would say, "Please, por favor, please, we're doing an inspection." I never saw a driver refuse this request made by an armored officer flanked by a half-dozen of his rifle-wielding co-workers. The driver and any passengers would step out of the vehicle, they would be frisked, and officers would search their vehicle and trunk. I never saw officers find anything over dozens of stops. Once the search was done, an officer would hand back the driver's license, if they had them, thank them, and the driver and passengers would leave. Sometimes the driver would thank the officers, usually a short gracias, before getting back into their car and driving off. These types of stops focused almost exclusively on young men, especially if multiple men were in a single vehicle. Officers justified this profiling on the grounds that men, especially groups of men, were those that would be responsible for violence tied to gangs or narco-trafficking. Their vehicles, by extension, were likely conduits for drugs, weapons, and as one officer said, potentially kidnapped persons. Again, never saw drugs or weapons, much less a kidnapped person in the trunk. Officers freely explained how they would also target vehicles based on how they looked. Vehicles with vidrio polarizado, or tinted windows, were a common target because, as officers also explained, the tints helped hide weapons and drugs, as well as concealing how many passengers are in the vehicle, again aiding with the possibility of gang violence and narco-trafficking. After the stop of this particular red Chevy, with deep tints and aftermarket rims, Jefe Gomez walked over and commented, "Mi toda la maldad va por aquí, sin documentos, polarizado." All the bad goes through here. No documents, tinted windows. After several more stops of cars with tints and a mix of aftermarket rims or spoilers or decals, Gomez commented about an earlier stop of a red Jetta. He asked me, "You saw that red car from earlier, right? The red Jetta." I said, "I did." "How many years would you have to work to afford a car like that?" And I said, "I don't know, a couple years probably." He nodded to me knowingly and then shrugs. "It's expensive, no?" When we stopped him, the chavo, he said it was his. So it's probably something he bought with what he made from stealing or from selling drugs. Cars were certainly not the sole target of stops and searches, however. Mopeds were also stopped because, as officers explained to me, they were commonly used as quick and effective ways to transport drugs through the thick traffic of Mexico City. Once again, never found any drugs, never found any weapons. Unlike closed motor vehicles, mopeds and motorcycles enable officers to more accurately profile citizens based on specific characteristics, such as tattoos, such as this gentleman here. One officer explained such a stop. He said, you can see their clothes, tattoos, se ven malcarados. Malcarados literally meaning bad-faced, but translated into something more akin to, he's got a bad look about him. He's mean-mugging or he's suspicious. The female officer, the only one who ever rode with this particular squad, explained that such stops are not all that different from profiling in the US. She explained to me while we were eating lunch, it's the same as in the US. The police aren't supposed to, but they'll stop you because you're Latino, she said, pointing to me, because of what you look like. Here it's the clothes or the tattoos or whatever it might be. It's the same thing. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the red jet. I'm trying to do notes on my phone. This is the moped. That's me in the background again. So this photo was actually given to me by officers. Don't actually record data in the field by and large. There's like no centralized recording of who you stopped when and what time, what did you find or not. What they do is take pictures on WhatsApp and they send that to their commander, and where those pictures go, no one knows. Every now and again they would send me copies of the pictures, which is why you can see me in this particular image. There's another image from the reverse angle that's of me taking a picture in this direction. This one happens to have a neck tattoo and like a full sleeve on this side that you can't see. This is the tattooed gentleman on the motorcycle. This is part of, so unlike the proactive stops, this particular set of stops on this street, they just parked off the side of the highway, and then officers just started picking the cars that they liked. They would just start walking in the middle of the highway and start moving, they'd start motioning like this. They just pull people off the highway, seemingly at random, but not at random. It was almost exclusively young men, often men in groups. Again, cars like this one that had aftermarket black rims, that they had a spoiler, tinted windows. Again, similar things here into the US. The bigger difference, of course, is they just openly told me about it. They just explained to me very clearly what was happening. In the US, I have never had someone explain to me that that's how officers choose to stop cars. This was not seen as a problem by the officers that I wrote or spoke with. Young men are also targeted for walking stops. Officers jumping out of their trucks to stop, surround, and then search their bodies and belongings on the barest pretext. Of course, those stopped don't even need to be walking. They can be standing, sitting, smoking a cigarette, playing a handball, or just heading into a local park with their bicycle. After seeing such blatantly warrantless stops, I asked officers how they justified them. Officer Suarez, a shorter, round-faced officer who always wore sunglasses, used a pseudo-legal justification to justify such stops. He explained, while revisiones, revisions, required a written order, such as the search of a house or a car that's parked, or a business or some other immobile, some immobile object, a motor vehicle or walking stop is classified as an inspección, or an inspection. That does not require such documentation or order. I asked him what would happen if a citizen were to refuse to have their property or their body searched, and he replied matter-of-factly, well, they have to. If they refuse, it's evasion. If it's a lawful order, you have to. El que nada debe, nada teme. Literally translated to he who owes nothing, fears nothing. A Mexican rendition of US officers' claims that if you're not doing anything or hiding anything, you have nothing to worry about. Though this justification might underlie street-level practices, it does not square with legal reality. Article 16 of the Mexican Constitution explicitly states, for example, that nadie puede ser molestado en su persona, familia, domicilio, papeles o posesiones, sino en virtud de mandamiento escrito de la autoridad competente, que funde y motive la causa legal del procedimiento. In English, no one shall be molested in his person, family, domicile, papers, or possessions, except by virtue of a written order of the competent authority stating the legal grounds and justification for the actions taken. As you might imagine, I saw exactly 0 such orders during my time in the field. Other officers recognize this disjuncture, and they suggest that if citizens were to invoke their legal rights, they would maybe be left alone. Jefe Gomez explained to me, if the person invokes Article 16, we just leave it alone. It's too much of a hassle when they start with all this human rights stuff. If they say Article 16, then we just let them go. I asked him, well, do they have to say it? And he says, yeah, otherwise we just have to search. I said, okay, but even if they don't say it, the law is the law, isn't it? He explained, well, yes and no. Like I said earlier, we have a job to do, and the checks are to keep people safe. I pushed him and I asked him, what would happen if someone refused without specifically citing Article 16? He shrugged and he told me, well, there's 2 ways to be a police officer. A las buenas, a las malas. The easy way or the hard way. So I asked him, so you would force them? He said, sometimes, yes. If I thought they had something, a weapon or drugs, maybe. During a different conversation with Gomez, I asked him how he justified these stops to someone from the Human Rights Office. And he explained to me, I'm not violating anyone's human rights. I'm not hitting them, I'm not yelling at them, I'm working. Now, like I said, if they start with Article 16 in the Constitution, that's one thing. But I also have a job to do, and I have to maintain the security and the citizenry of this city. Now in Mexico all the time it's, oh, my rights, my human rights. It's not a matter of justifying it, it's my job, and I have to work. I have my protocols, I don't mistreat people. It's my job. Despite a general lack of aggressive rudeness or wanton violence during these interactions, I never saw officers beat someone, I never saw officers handcuff someone, throw them on the ground, nothing like that. Every stop and search represents one of innumerable intrusions on liberty. That, under color of law and in the name of public safety, weaken the legitimacy of the police as an institution and the state that they represent. Worse, the consequences of these stops are likely to reverberate well beyond the bounds of a single police-citizen interaction. This stop, for example, was made on a man standing and talking on his phone near what officers called a punto rojo, the Mexican equivalent to a hotspot, that quickly conflates geography and criminal incidents with the moral culpability of local residents. These interactions do not occur in a vacuum. A group of young boys watches armored officers with rifles stand watch while another officer pats down the man, finding nothing. Though it is too soon to say what these interactions mean for the development of these children, such interactions, even if experienced vicariously by boys too young to bear the brunt of state suspicion and punitive control, are part of the bedrock upon which the relationship with the police and the state is built. Beyond searches of citizens on public streets, Metro Police also engage in what can be characterized as investigative raids of private residences. In this particular case, a security camera captured an armed robbery perpetrated by two men on a city street. In response to this video footage and some grainy indication of the building that these men might have fled into, police were deployed to begin searching surrounding buildings. These officers are part of a special group within the Metropolitan Police known as Zorros, or Foxes, denoted by their black uniforms and special training in things like hostage rescue, explosives, advanced weaponry, anti-terrorism, things of that nature. Now note, these officers are being used to pursue street-level bank robbers and are entering private Mexican residences. I'm going to fast forward to the end. The gist is that these officers walk in, they use a mixture of pleases, they also kick doors, they bang on doors. It's not 5 officers, it's not 10 officers, it's 50 officers running through these apartment complexes, trying to get access to private residences to find these bank robbers, who they do not find, to be clear. Beyond the actual act of this sort of violence, these officers' attempts to anonymize themselves, they take off their patches for their own safety, they say. Citizens see officers walk in here with balaclavas over their faces, they've taken off their name patches, they've taken off their unit patches. What they see is an anonymous state. They are learning what Tracy Mears and Ben Justice refer to as the informal curriculum of the criminal justice system. They are not part of the body that is to be protected, they are part of a body that is to be policed wantonly. They are to be subject by the state, not protected by it. I am short on time though, so I want to wrap and just say that these are preliminary findings from just a little bit of fieldwork in Mexico City. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you. Good.
Thank you. Last but not least, Rachel Ford.
Hi, everybody. I'm okay. Can people hear me? Is that okay? All right, then I'm good. Thanks. Hey, y'all. So my name's Rachel. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, Andres, for having me, for inviting me. I'm an organizer in Brooklyn. I'm not a researcher, so it's exciting to be in a space like this with you all. I work at an organization called the Brooklyn Community Bail Funds, and I direct our Court Watch project there that Andres has been so helpful and supportive with us on. So I'm really excited to be here. Thanks to our presenters who just gave those amazing talks. I want to give a few reflections before I go into talking about the work that we do in Brooklyn and New York City. So I thought it was really interesting and excited to talk with you all further after this too, to think about sort of these differences in localities between Mexico context, Brazil, and then myself thinking about the United States. the differences in the access to courts, in the actors that each of the presenters were sort of speaking about and pushing on, whether that be the police or court actors, generally prosecutors in our case. But there really being this like common challenge of this lack of systemic or systems level institutional transparency and accountability. I think, Michael, the fact that the police aren't even writing down what's happening and are literally taking pictures and sending them on WhatsApp is a great example of them not even recording it, much less that information being accessible to the public, right? And this common problem of just flagrant abuse of power, violence, and way too many people incarcerated pretrial, this overuse of pretrial detention, and the ways in which like different actors are allowing for that to happen. And I think it's powerful to see how observations of carceral actors, court actors, or the police through custody hearings or through ethnographic research is this way a tactic to address the challenges and the problems that we're seeing and to address these injustices, right? It's a way to demand accountability of actors, and it's a way to ensure implementation of reforms, which I think was really interesting to hear about the custody hearings in Brazil, and also the sort of reforms in the Mexico context of what does it mean to have reform happen but implementation not actually take place, and how observations can be a mechanism to get there, and how we can get creative with interventions when we think about observations. So that's a lot of what my work's focused on too, so I'm excited to talk with you all about that. So I'm going to turn us to the US context, specifically New York. Like I said, I'm based in Brooklyn. I'm an organizer there. We think about court watching and court observations as a mechanism for ensuring bail reform and system accountability. So I'm going to talk less about the mechanics of what we're observing specifically, and more about the method as a practice and a way of building power and ensuring change, because that's just what my work is focused on. So yeah, this is what we're going to do real quick. I'm going to talk about the U.S. context of bail and pretrial detention, mass incarceration, bail, pretrial detention. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but do want to give some background. And then talk about our work as a bail fund and our work of our Court Watch project. Give some lessons learned quickly and just a few questions that might help as we go into discussion after this. All right, so the US, most of us probably know this, but I know we're all from many different places here in this room. We incarcerate way too many people, right, disproportionately, right? 5% of the world's population, 20%, 22% of the world's prisoners, millions and millions of people locked up under some other system of carceral control. And a major driver of mass incarceration in the United States is the amount of people who are being detained pre-trial. So people that are not convicted, that are being held before their trial has happened. You can see here, it's, I think, what does it say? It's like 99% of the growth in jails over the last 15 years has been because of this huge growth in the pretrial population. And most folks that are detained pretrial are there because they cannot afford bail. In New York, this is data just from October 1st. New York City jails, 78% of them, 78% of people in New York City jails are there pretrial unconvicted, and 47% of those people are there because of the inability to afford bail. So I know, I think Anna brought up bail a little bit, but I know it's not a system that's necessarily, or a mechanism used as prevalent as it is in the United States, right, especially in New York. And money bail is a thing that we talk about a lot. And that's because it's something that is one of the main ways that people are being detained, and I think there's also sort of these widely held notions that it's messed up to be holding people in just because of the amount of money that they have, right? So do folks know, I'm going to do a little bit of bail 101 just because it's what I do, and I want to make sure we're on the same page because I think it's how we understand the problem. So bail is a condition of release, right? In the US, money is often what that condition is. You're supposed to be able to afford your bail because it's supposed to be a financial incentive for you to return to your court dates. The judge asks for a certain amount of money, you pay it, you go home, you fight your case is over, you get that money back. It's not supposed to be punishment. In practice, that's not at all what happens, right? in prisons, anyone who can't pay, it intensifies the huge racial and economic disparities that are so prevalent in our criminal legal system, right? I should have mentioned that obviously most of the people that are locked up in the United States are black and brown folks, way disproportionate to general populations. Bail also coerces guilty pleas, right? You see this is from the work that we've done. You're 9 times more likely in a misdemeanor to plead guilty if you're held in on bail, right? So that you don't have to, so that you can go home. It also determines case outcomes. You're way likely to get your case dismissed if you're out free to fight your case. These are things that many of us know and probably span across international context. But yeah, and it also leads to all these horrendous consequences. So here I just went through really quickly some of these big problems that we're trying to solve for, right? There's way too many people locked up or under control of the state. A major driver of this is the number of folks who are detained pretrial, and many of the people detained pretrial are there for the inability to afford bail. So my organization, the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund, what do? We pay bail for people. We actually put up money as a charity using money from the community to bail folks out. That's the first level of it. We also know we can't pay our way out of that problem, right? That it's systemic, right? So we fight for the abolition of the money bail system entirely, and also to end all forms of pretrial detention and surveillance, knowing that the bigger problem is not just that wealth-based detention, but that pretrial detention as an entirety is the problem. So as advocates and organizers, we talk about a lot that there's many ways that we can achieve these goals, right? Many levers that can be pushed on, whether through legislation, litigation, judicial orders, prosecutor policies. There's many ways to get to the answer that we want. But oftentimes when state actors enact reforms, the actual implementation of the change isn't as transformative as expected. We heard this at the panelists or the presenters before me. And I think this is because, which seems obvious, right? Like we pass a law, but then the same state actors are the ones being charged to put that law into practice, and they do that without any accountability to the communities most impacted by the law itself. So we believe to achieve actual real reform and change, the answers really lie in community-led accountability projects and campaigns, which gets me to why we started our project called Court Watch New York City. It's a prosecutor-focused accountability project, and it's a community and power-building project as well, right? So observations are one part of it, data collection is one part of it, but the general framework is around power building and community building. So the project started it came out of the DA election, the prosecutor elections in Brooklyn last summer of 2016, when basically like 7 people ran against one another, all on incredibly quote-unquote progressive campaigns. It was wild. It was like everyone was trying to out-progress one another. Sort of like the social capital now in prosecutor. Anyway, they ran on a lot of them ran on platforms that they would say they'd stop requesting money bail on misdemeanor cases, which is important because the number one determinant of whether a judge will set bail is whether or not the prosecutor requests it. And so for us, once this DA got elected, the Brooklyn DA Gonzalez, who said he would stop requesting this, it was really important for us to think about how do we hold him accountable to doing this, because that's a way for us to get at our larger vision of eliminating money bail, at least for misdemeanors, right? So we started this Court Watch project, and we did it with 2 other organizations. One was a grassroots base building organization, which is important for the community power building part of what we do. And then one was a group of public defenders that organize outside of their regular day jobs. Also important for providing actual legal knowledge and political education that is such a big part of our project. So why do we focus on the prosecutors, right? Prosecutors have incredible power. They decide who is incarcerated for what and for how long, and they have wide discretion as to all of these different things that impact a person's case and the outcome. They also work for us, right? So our prosecutors are elected, which means that the only people that they actually are supposed to be responsive to are the people who put them into office, which is the people they represent. So with Court Watch NYC, we train New Yorkers to watch court 6 days a week in 2 different boroughs, in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and we record quantitative and qualitative data, and we report out this information through Twitter on a daily basis, right from court, through a weekly blog, and then also through like more traditional reports. But they're kind of zines and newsletters. We try to be a little bit less academic-y and yet also have rigorous data, which thankfully Andreas is helping us with. Right, so our first goal is to collect and publish data about prosecutor behavior, particularly around what's happening in the courtroom, about their, in relationship to their publicly announced promises, because just in the context in which we are, our prosecutors are making a lot of quote-unquote progressive promises, and so we're really there to make sure they're doing those things and to push them further. So I want to give an example of what that looks like, because and I'm going to use our Twitter because it is our main method of getting information out into the world. So this is, after I said, I talked about how these DAs were saying they were going to stop requesting money bail on misdemeanors. So we had court watchers in the courtroom in Manhattan when the Manhattan DA said the same thing. And tweeted out, you know, this Manhattan DA, the assistant district attorney, requested $7,500 bail on this misdemeanor shoplifting case. Like, why aren't you following your own policy? Like, what's going on here? And what's, I think, really interesting about this Twitter feed is that Joan replies. And Joan was the Manhattan DA's director of communications. And so she replies to us directly and says, thank you so much for watching. You know, we really want you guys to be involved. And if you see it, it's hard to read. But basically she says, here's the reasons why we requested money bail in this case, which revealed two things. One of which was that there was the policy, this quote-unquote progressive policy that the DAs were getting wide notoriety for ending money bail, was riddled with exceptions. It actually was that the exceptions were the rule. So, but no one knew that because no one was reading the fine print and no one was actually seeing how this was implemented in practice. But through our court watchers being in the room, we could see, here she says, this person got money bail set because they have an extensive criminal history, 21 misdemeanor convictions. So it revealed these exceptions, which sort of helped us parse that these policies aren't that progressive in the first place at all. And then the second really powerful thing I think about this exchange and the way that it was used through Twitter is that the community then got to directly respond to Joan. And so they got to say, like, you know, someone like David, I don't know who David is, but he said, you know, such garbage. If someone had 21 misdemeanors, that probably means they need help or services. All you can imagine is cages. Community members directly being able to say back to the DA's office, this is not what we want. We actually want these people to be free. And so that was like an exciting sort of dynamic to see happen in a purpose of our project. She also responded to this tweet and then stopped responding, and now she doesn't work for the DA, so. Another example of this is, another big announcement this summer was that the Manhattan DA, for like the 12th time, said they were going to stop prosecuting marijuana possession and smoking cases starting August 1st. So we had our watchers really focus on drug cases over the summer. And we're about to publish a report on what we've seen, but you know, right away, just very clearly, cases are still being prosecuted after August 1st in Manhattan. We're not really seeing any type of slowdown. There was one day where they dismissed a lot of cases as like this like public, like here we are dismissing all these cases, but still in the end of September, cases are still coming through. Okay, really quickly. Our second goal is to foster a culture of accountability and transparency, right? By bringing New Yorkers in the courtroom. And this is what I was talking about a little bit about the practice of observations being a big, not just the observations themselves, but the practice being a big part of why we think this work is important. Because it's about shifting power. The idea that if there are community members in the courtroom, that their mere presence can shift the outcome of a case in real time, right? Because I know I behave a lot differently when my boss is in the room. And so we have our court watchers wear bright yellow t-shirts. We are sort of public about that. And this is, I know this might be a privilege for being in the American context, right? That no one's getting thrown out of courtrooms, that like it technically is a public space. You're allowed to be there, especially in New York. But this is an important part of our project. And finally, last goal is to really raise awareness about the role and power of district attorneys. Criminal legal system everywhere, but also in the United States, it's intentionally designed not to be transparent, not to be accessible for folks, right? It's this black box. And we think through doing sort of political education through our trainings, and also through by just having New Yorkers in the courtroom, it's a way for people to understand it better, and then therefore hopefully to move them to change and activate them around, you know, building power to push for something different, right? So yes, so things that we've learned. It's really important to tell the story that the system won't tell about itself. In New York, they do record a lot of stuff, but the system records the data they want to record, and they release the data they want to release, and they do it in the ways that help benefit the stories they want to tell. This is something Andreas has been really helpful in having us see, is that we are empowered to tell the story that we know is real based on what we think about, what we can hear, what we can write down, what we can share out. And I think that the exceptions example I gave about Twitter is a good example of that, of the nuances of what actually is happening in practice. The power of social media, I know I'm like a millennial, but I also, but I think there is something powerful about what Twitter has allowed for us in terms of real-time accountability in the moment, right? And allowing for broader community engagement of folks who aren't even in the courtroom right there. And then this idea that I just talked about at the end of that, the presence of community members, of observers, can shift power in real time, right? It's not just about the observations that come out of it, but about the practice of doing that itself. And the impact on case outcomes and people's lives in the moment. So just a few questions to lead with, and I'm gonna stop, and then we can, I don't even know what time it is. The clock's not right. How can court observations be used to put pressure on other actors beyond the prosecutor? So thinking about the practice of observing as well as the outcome of observations. And then what would it look like? What does it even look like to have a truly accountable and transparent legal system? I think it's something we're all talking about, but what does that even mean in the context of our particular localities? How can observations as a method help get us there? And what role should community members and people play in making this happen? Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Your presenters, please come up. We are running behind schedule. There is coffee and tea and snacks outside. Feel free to grab some and then come back if you like.
El 2013 publicamos esto, que es, digamos,
Bueno, correcto. Perfecto. Para una de las clases. Sí. ¿Cómo están? ¿Bien?
Sorry, it's hilarious. I'm in California.
How are you?
Yeah, so, why do you think organizing schools?
Because I think we live in a interconnected world. Our reality is not only seeing it's important for us to organize, learn about what people sense like police violence, only it's just how to figure out how to do it. So we're going to being I'll write it. And are you still here?
Yes, I am. Not the criminal justice school, but.
Yeah, well, I didn't even think that everybody was leaving.
And what do you think that we can learn from
You can make friends.
Yeah.
You can see what other problems that we have here looks like, problems elsewhere, and how other countries are Right, you staying or are you going?
I have to go now.
Yeah, right. Okay, but how about tomorrow?
Maybe I can go. Maybe I want to go on there.
Until 2 p.m. Not for pizza. All right. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Sí, sí, sí. Sí, 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 vamos tarde, o sea, vamos tarde, sí.
como digo, eso era la mayoría pues
All right. Luis.
So take a few now before people come in.
You need the mic? You need the mic? So say this, get started 10 minutes.
Y no le pagan
Sí, claro, sí, ya que si no.
La mayoría de los
Back, we're going to get started.
de varios empiezan trabajando. Ellos vienen una hora de su casa, hacer su informe para regresar.
All right,
Para hacer su actividad de publicidad.
we're gonna start up.
Es muy diferente.
So we're going to start out. We have approximately 10 minutes for questions. Me and Poppy are going to go around and raise your hands. And oh, we have a question.
So thank you, all of you, for very interesting presentations. I have a question for both Anna and Rachel. So I find really important and powerful the method you are using. I think that this idea of producing both quantitative and qualitative data is very interesting, powerful, and it has like a possibility of actually overcome the divide between qualitative and quantitative methods, which is quite powerful right now. And so I would like to understand a bit better the analytical approach you are using to just like have a better sense of to what extent this is replicable and what are the kinds of like variables you're looking at more specifically. And also, maybe this is more for Anna, I would like to get to know better like the kind of reception that these kind of data are having in Mexico, obviously mainly from like civil servants and policymakers. Thank you.
So let's take a few questions and then you guys will answer the first round.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. I have a couple of questions to Anna. Also, you mentioned this difference in pretrial detention between states, between 50% to 90%. I was wondering if you can be more precise about which states are the ones that have these different levels. And if you have some ideas about what are the factors, what are the elements that play a role in explaining these differences. And also I have another very, very small question about if there is official data on the decisions taken by the judges in the states in Mexico after the beginning of the process of reform of criminal justice on this area of prison on remand or pretrial detention.
My question is for Dr. Sierra and also Rachel. So in the Mexican context, so I was wondering sort of the impact of like the equipment, right? That the cops are in like these big tanks and how they're dressed and things like that. And if you talk to them about like how that kind of plays into the power dynamics of people being able to refuse being searched, because I know you said that they say, well, please come search you, but there isn't really that decision, I imagine, when someone's dressed the way that they dress and have these sort of powerful weapons and are moving to the cities with tanks and things like that. So I wonder if you engage in this conversation and what that looks like. And then my question for Rachel is, so I imagine that with the community members that you guys are collaborating with are sort of the usual suspects, right? That come to the table that are really passionate about the topic, but I'm wondering if on the flip side, you can push back about sort of what you found in the court, if people sort of feel like the court is operating the way that it should be, and that these people are, being held accountable, and it's fine. I'm wondering if you've gotten pushback on the flip side, and I only ask that because I lived in Brooklyn for a couple of years, and now I live in the Midwest, and it's a very divisive city, St. Louis, and so I'm sort of seeing both sides of it already for my short time there, so I'm just wondering what that sort of flip side perspective looks on this court process.
Can I add another question to Mike? Very, thank you. Michael, I was wondering if there are other type of empirical information about levels of trust and legitimacy of prison or police officers in Mexico City beyond the ones that you quoted. Particularly if there are some empirical quantitative studies about police encounters with citizens and the evaluation of these encounters by the population at large.
Rodrigo, which is the reaction of the system about those cases in the defendant felt that the police forced them or used the violence? Which is the reaction of the prosecutor or judges in those points?
All right, so I heard two questions that were anchored towards me, which I'll answer both. So the first was about quantitative and qualitative data and the pairing of those two. So we have two different forms that folks fill out. One is a quantitative form. Andreas helped us with designing this. It's check boxes around things that you would expect, right? What the charge was, the demographics, what the bail request was, how the case resolved, if it did in court. So these are things our volunteers check through. They sit next to a partner who has a qualitative form, which is pretty much a free-for-all. It's basically, it could just be a blank sheet of paper, although we do have some questions on it. And what we guide folks through with that form is that this is where you're supposed to record the stuff that can't get captured in a checkbox. So for example, when you hear a case, for example, a case that happened a few weeks ago was a petty larceny case. So one volunteer checked the box that said petty larceny, right? So sort of a small form of stealing. What the person wrote down in the qualitative form was that it was a coworker who stole the banana from a banana of their other coworker, and then that other coworker hit them, and they were cross-complainants, but that the nuance of what that charge meant was that it was stealing a banana, right? Which you wouldn't get if you were just checking boxes. I think that's a really important thing. And for us, it's been relatively easy to implement because they're just two different forms and two people sit together and then they switch off what types of data they're recording every other case. And I would say the other thing that we do is we have folks fill out a reflection form at the end, because another piece of information data point that we think is important is the court watcher's experience of the courtroom and what they're noticing, what they're feeling, what they're sensing, what it feels like to be in that space, what they notice about who else is present, and what they notice about the tone and the language of the judge when they're in the room, when they're not, obviously not when they're not in the room, but just how the judges talk to folks who are accused, what the public defenders act like, what the DAs do. Again, sort of more reflective, but I think are important data points for how the criminal legal system is sort of operating. So that's, I hope, somewhat of an answer to what you asked. In terms of the question around pushback, on one level, when you first said it, I was thinking about how I showed you guys one example of the DAs responding on Twitter. We've also had the Brooklyn DAs communications folks respond to other posts that our watchers have put up on Twitter, sort of disputing the things that people saw, right? Of like, no, you don't understand, this is part of this legal statute, yada, yada, and sort of trying to be like, no, this is fine, this is how it works. And I think our point always being that what our watchers see and experience and feel is a valid story in itself and is truth in it, like that we're just all reproducing truths in different ways, right? And so therefore we don't get caught up in like whether or not the accuracy of even if the DAs are disputing some of the things people are seeing. But this more sort of nuanced question around pushback from volunteers themselves. We have comrades in Massachusetts who are also doing a court watch program and have this experience where the people they train and go into the courts and are like, it's not that, I mean, like, I expected it to be worse. I wouldn't say we've had too much of that experience. I mean, we've trained almost 600 New Yorkers. Most people are pretty, I don't know if they're shocked, I think they're just like, yeah, this is bad, this is not good. And I think part of how we sort of prep people for that is the training we do is political education. So we talk about how violence is happening at every single level. Like even if you come in and your case gets dismissed, you were still held for 24 hours, you were still probably illegally arrested, like all of these things that can happen to people, sort of questioning the validity of the system itself, even if it's quote unquote working as it should. I think we know what that actually means too. So, yeah.
Sobre la reacción de los operadores a la denuncia de la violencia en las audiencias, o que ocurre es o seguinte. Embora as audiências tenham sido criadas para a denúncia e processamento destes casos, muitos jueces e fiscales eram contrários à criação das audiências de custódia. Em Brasil, quando havia a prisão em flagrante, o indivíduo ficava no cárcel durante muito tempo, hasta uma audiência com o juez. Agora são 24 horas para a apresentação e el análisis del caso, tanto de la violencia de la policía, cuanto de la pertinencia o no de la permanencia en el cárcel. Muchos eran contrarios. No entanto, fueron implantadas en todo el país. O que ocurre? Muchos jueces conservadores, punitivistas, contrários a garantias e a mecanismos de responsabilização, incluso de la violencia de la policía, ocuparam espaço em las audiencias de custodia, ou seja, quisieran ser os jueces encarregados disto. Então, muitos destes jueces estão ali para que não sejam efetivas, para que se mantenham presos e para que a violência da polícia não seja processada. Então, por isso, em los dados do Conselho de Justiça, solo 4% de los presos denunciam. No entanto, observando a audiência, se percebe que são pelo menos 20%. Já há aí uma diferença que decorre de quê? De que os jueces não perguntam, não registram, não encaminham, há problemas com isso. Também não há em Brasil o crime de perjúrio, ou seja, o indivíduo pode dizer sofrer violência, mesmo que isto não seja provado. E não há perícia, não há mecanismos para garantir a produção de prova. Se há lesão, se há alguma coisa que possa ser comprovada mediante exames, esses exames não são realizados. Então, a denúncia cai no vazio, não é encaminhada, os policiais não são responsabilizados. E ainda mais, em muitas audiências, em 80% das audiências que observamos, há policias em las audiências. Ou seja, vão para as audiências para constranger, para impedir que as denúncias sejam processadas, que aconteçam. Então, o que se percebe é que o mecanismo das audiências foi uma boa iniciativa, uma janela para observar todas essas coisas. No entanto, há uma reação conservadora em Brasil contra todo isso, mesmo no interior da magistratura, porque há movimento articulado, organizado de jueces antigarantistas, que dizem garantias de direitos estão contribuindo em Brasil para o aumento da violência. Não queremos isso. Queremos que a polícia seja dura, que seja violenta incluso contra os bandidos. E por isso vamos fazer nosso papel como jueces, que é de dar salvo-conduto às polícias. Isso está muito claro em Brasil. que hay este movimiento y está articulado incluso con una propuesta del candidato a presidente Bolsonaro de una excludente de ilicitud para muertes praticadas por policías, así como en Filipinas. Si un policía mata, está autorizado, no se pregunta cómo fue. Esto es una propuesta de campaña, en campaña electoral. Entonces, lo que es más grave es que todo eso tiene hoy respaldo en el interior del campo jurídico. Jueces, fiscales, que producen toda una nueva doctrina jurídica para justificar, claro, algo que es una tradición en Brasil, que no es algo nuevo, un modelo inquisitivo, autoritario, con una cultura jurídica muy atrasada. No entanto, ahora todo eso tem sido atualizado a partir de uma tentativa de justificar todos estes casos como a necessidade de combate ao crime. E por isso, mesmo com todo o aparato das audiências de custódia, não se processa, não se responsabiliza, porque isso não é algo que se pretenda e com isso se legitima a violência da polícia. As audiências acabam cumprindo este papel porque se hace, pero não tienen eficácia.
About how do we process information, just as Rachel mentioned, it's more or less the same. We build, apart from the instrument that of course we've been perfecting, and it's not perfect, but yeah, we've been improving the way we gather the information, and then we process it through with the database, and we apply some statistical models and so on. But one thing that it's kind of important for us is that our National Criminal Procedural Code is it's over-regulated. So basically it gives you the variables that you can measure about bail hearing, because it's very specific on what the prosecutor can ask and what the defender can debate. So that makes easier to build the variables in a sense. So how this information is received, it depends. Sometimes we have projects of technical assistance. We are particularly, our expertise is about implementing pretrial services in Mexico. So sometimes we do it in the context of this technical assistance, and it works to give us some information to the actors, and they start to do some changes. But pretrial detention, it's a very volatile thing. So it has a lot of political pressure around it, so sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. And another kind of intervention that we do this like from our activist heart as a civil society organization, that we do some campaigns against it, and we have had some hearings in the Inter-American Commission to fight against a particular figure that we have, which is the mandatory pretrial detention. We have a catalog of constitutional offenses that oblige the judges to impose pretrial detention. So this catalog is very broad, and that's coming to the second question. One of the factors that definitely adds to the pretrial rates in Mexico is this type of pretrial detention. There are very different interpretations of what certain categories of the mandatory offenses in the Constitution are. We have specifically the categories crimes committed with violent means and explosives. That's the whole category. But that means it's in certain jurisdictions that only by, for instance, robbing someone with verbal violence means violent mean. So that amounts to mandatory pretrial detention. This particular interpretation is used in one of the jurisdictions that we found out that they almost impose pretrial detention in almost 100% of the cases. So about the data, there's data from the courts, but it's not public. So you have to ask it, to request it through public information requests in Mexico. And what's definitely, there's no record on this, is about the request of prosecutors. The prosecution officers never register this kind of information, and the courts do not do it. So that's information that you can only get through observations. And about the rates, it depends. We haven't measured all the states. So state of Mexico is the one almost 100%, Mexico City around 50, but other jurisdictions are over 60 or 70%, like Morelos and Chihuahua, which is supposedly some of the more advanced states in the criminal justice reform, that still happens very hard due to mandatory pretrial detention.
I will answer the second question first. Are there any quantitative measures of police, or perceptions of police legitimacy in Mexico? I think the short answer is I don't really know very well. I would suggest checking in VPA. I don't know the full scope of the questions asked in that particular survey or the quality of those questions. I very much doubt that it's at the incident level to be able to actually look at the effect of a particular interaction. The person that you might want to reach out to if you are interested in that particular kind of data is Rodrigo Canales. He's at the Yale School of Management. He's part of he's one of my collaborators, an ongoing project with the Mexico City Police. The quality of the data is going to be better in Mexico City than probably anywhere else. So looking at Mexico at large is, I don't envy the task of doing that. Second question, a little bit more detail on that question. So the short answer to that is no. I did not ask them specifically, do you think that they would be more likely to say no if you didn't have the equivalent of an M16 on your chest? I don't have a counterfactual either. So I've only observed this particular kind of unit. So they always had rifles, sometimes rifles and leg holstered pistols. And again, it's anywhere between 6 and 12 officers. They just surround the car. I do have a comparison case with the US. And in the US context as well, we know that people very rarely use their rights in the context of saying, you may not search my vehicle without a warrant. And they don't have rifles across their chests. They're just uniformed officers. Usually it's 1, maybe 2, and they have a pistol on their hip. And people still give consent. And so I didn't see a difference in them saying no more times in the US. I also saw them say no in the US, and I did a lot more out, about over 1,000 hours here in the US. And I didn't see them say no either. If anything, we're just getting close to a ceiling effect where they were going to say yes anyways, and they're just definitely going to say yes with 12 rifles.
Please join me to close the panel and thank our presenters. So we're going to move right into that second panel. We're running a little bit behind, so if you need to use the restroom, get a coffee, maybe this is the moment to do it, but we're going to just get started and with the second panel, have a different chair now. So please go ahead.
All right. Good morning. Welcome to Rutgers University. My name is Chris Chacueta. I'm currently a third-year PhD student at Rutgers. Following the same format as our previous session will be a session focusing on interventions. And so first, challenging the status quo mobilization experiences in Latin American prisons will be Isabel Arriagada, lawyer from the University of Chile. Currently a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, and working at the founder of NGO, Leaso. Second will be the thin blue line of health, police contact and well-being in the core and party of Europe will be Valerio Bacek and Robert Apel. Both are assistant professor and professor at Rutgers University. And then last will be Mila Saracena from the Open Society Foundation. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Isabel.
Thank you. Good morning, buenos días. First of all, I would like to thank Andres Rengifo for inviting me and all of us to this path-breaking workshop. Different people, background, interests, and countries, it's always very exciting. And I would also like to thank Felipe Salazar, my fellow Chilean, for helping me to organize this visit. So here we go. In 2014, when I was applying to a PhD in sociology here in the US, in one of the Skype meetings, the director of graduate studies of one of these universities asked, Isabel, I looked at your CV. It looks interesting, but how are you going to reconcile your role as an activist and your role as a scholar? I thought it was a good question. As a lawyer and an activist, I, with a group of colleagues, founded NGO Le Azul, that stands from Litigación Estructural de América del Sur. You can find it in www.leazul.cl. You can take it now, probably here. So, in Le Azul, I have advocated for the abolition of the carceral state. However, as a scholar, I belong to the tradition called sociology of punishment. From here, I've tried to dissect arguments and research evidence to assess both the benefits and harms of the deployment of state punishment. In this presentation, I will briefly describe some of my experiences in Le Azul as a lawyer and activist in Chile, and the relationship that Le Azul has had with public officials and government agents. These experiences are anecdotal, but they have opened the path to my broader research agenda. After telling you about Le Azul, I will introduce the concept of caring bureaucracies and explain why I believe that this concept represents a useful framework to understand the penal state for both activists and scholars from the global south and the global north. So here's one of my anecdotes. Do you hear me well? Yes. I remember going to the penitentiary in Santiago, Chile, to meet with one of my clients. The penal population in the penitentiary is about 7,000 inmates, but the facility allows for fostering only 3,000, as is usually the case in Latin American prisons, right? You know that. So despite being one of the most flourishing Latin American nations in terms of economic development, Chile ranks amongst the countries with the highest rates of imprisonment relative to crime rates. A recent report by the Supreme Court says that inmates in Chile experience abuses and torture in conditions of massive overcrowding. So I was in the penitentiary, and in this visit, I walked through the corridors to the room of legal assistance. So I, as a lawyer, provided free legal assistance to inmates in Santiago. And I waited for my client. You usually have to wait 15 minutes for somebody to tell that inmate inside the prison that their lawyers are visiting. So while I was waiting, I started talking with Miguel, one of the prison guards that I had met while working at Le Azul. He asked for a minute. So there is this prison guard, right? And he said, Isabel, can I have a minute with you? And he says, Miss, do you know Juan? Yes, I said. Juan was one of the mozos, the group of inmates that helped cleaning the penitentiary. He said, Miss, I believe that Juan must be innocent. If you could take a look at his case, like he doesn't belong here. And we would say in Chile, como que nada que ver aquí. Oh, he doesn't belong here. There's something wrong. So this prison guard wanted to help Juan and to help me to help him. He hasn't been the only one. Le Azul has received help from many government agents in different forms, times, and formats. I'm not naive. Le Azul has fought against the massive difficulties of navigating the penal system in Chile. We've tried to fight torture, cruel and degrading treatment. But I'm curious, how can we make sense of these efforts of state officials that, from their state agencies, like this prison guard, have reached to us, offered us their help? To give you some more examples, after founding the NGO Le Azul in 2014, I started having phone calls and Facebook messages from very random people, and there were lawyers and social workers from the government that wanted to help us and wanted to give us information from inside the government. Also, 3 public defenders have worked with us undercover. Their participation is secret. They cannot be officially part of the NGO, but they attend our meetings and help us to plan our cases. We have also worked in several opportunities with the government. We're part of the Civil Society Council of the Minister of Justice and the Civil Society Council of the Correctional Officers Agency. This same week, yesterday in fact, volunteers at Lea Sur are having our first seminar called Escuela de Formación Penitenciaria, which is the first workshop in which teachers are teaching students about penitentiary laws. And one of our students registered and that has attended is the director of the Minister of Justice in Santiago. And you cannot believe how intense was and the excitement of the WhatsApp group that we had and everybody taking pictures of this student, right? Our student. So alliances between civil society and government officials in Latin America are not uncommon. In Peru, the prison of San Juan de Lurigancho was considered one of the most dangerous prisons in the world. In the late 80s, a group of inmates in Block 7 in this prison built a democratic local government. Inmates in this unit undertake yearly elections in the prisons and collect taxes from inmates to provide maintenance and security to their unit. Paying attention to prisoners' self-organization, correctional authorities in Lurigancho, Peru, built a common managerial structure between officials and prisoners. Jose Perez, former Interior Ministry, has called this experience as the Lurigancho miracle. Nowadays, prisoners, delegates, and correctional officers run the prison in Peru collectively. Second case, in Uruguay, in 2014, authorities built a prison village that mimics the outside world. This prison is called Punta de Rieles. You can Google it too. It's fascinating. In Punta de Rieles, prisoners can circulate freely and use mobile phones to connect with their families. Prison guards are unarmed, and they are majority female. The model has caught the attention of authorities around the world as it offers a radical alternative to conventional prison systems. So third example, we already have Peru, Uruguay, and I'll offer you a third example from Chile as well. In 2010, a group of civil servants in Chile joined with the Spanish Agency for International Development to create a governmental program to provide, for the first time in the history of Chile, free legal assistance to inmates and report situations of abuse. So we had public defenders for defendants before the sentence. And these public defenders said, hey, we want to defend and we want to protect our clients' rights even though they have sentenced. So during their sentences, they're receiving legal assistance too. These are cases where state bureaucrats mobilized the law to produce institutional change in order to protect and fulfill the needs of penal populations. There are several examples of genuine efforts that come from state bureaucrats that are tired and exhausted of working in a penal system that degrades their users. And what's going on with the civil servants? They suffer cumulative emotional and psychological distress. There's also a thing called compassion fatigue. It's a state experienced by those helping people or animals in distress. Compassion fatigue is an extreme state of tension and preoccupation with the suffering of those being helped, to the degree that it can create a secondary traumatic stress for the helper. Caring too much can hurt. It leads to apathy, isolation, bottled up emotions, and substance use, for example. You can know more about compassion fatigue in the Compassion Fatigue Awareness Project. So from here, our experiences in Lea Sur, working vis-a-vis with government officials, and the cases of Lurigancho in Peru, Punta de Rieles in Uruguay, and the Chilean penitentiary defense,
They provide a fruitful terrain not only for exploring the moral sensibilities of state officials in prisons, but also to explore how institutional design in the criminal justice institutions incorporate caring discourses in institutional architecture, constitution, and procedures. As an activist, I have noticed that our success and in our organization relies on our capacity to form alliances and mobilize resources with state bureaucrats. Now I'm going to give you my opinion as a scholar, and I want to finish with this. Usually, we conceive state bureaucracies as something bad. Dominant sociological interpretations have emphasized the concern with the disproportionate expansion of the state that threatens the individual and denies their humanity. However, an incipient line of research started asking about the ways in which state bureaucrats' enthusiasm to provide a caring and legitimate services lead them to advocate for institutional change. Studies have also started to examine cases where state bureaucrats challenge the status quo and produce social and policy changes from within their agencies. The project of caring bureaucracies examines the possibilities of opening bureaucratic operations to the contextual and relational nature of human emotions while enforcing accountability, responsibility, and equal treatment. So the project of caring bureaucracies, the conceptual, the intellectual project of caring bureaucracies is trying to conceive penal institutions with both elements in mind. The emotions, the experiences, the relational nature of human beings within state institutions, and also the rule of law. We want agencies to be accountable, responsible, and to provide equal treatment. Feminist studies have applied the logic of caring democracies and developed this idea of caring bureaucracies. This intellectual project aims to reconcile the goal of developing caring relationships within the regimented, usually cold, and degrading operations of bureaucratic institutions. Now, this is not just a concept. Underlying this concept, there are several political commitments. First, the political commitment of caring bureaucracies is believing in the state. It's not an abolitionist agenda. It's a project that believes in the state. Second, it also believes that the state has the capacity to improve its operations. And we as social scientists and as an activist, we can contribute to the state to provide the elements and components of better institutions. And also, the third commitment that I find in this concept is to accept the idea that sometimes, under just conditions, crime requires being punished. So it's not an abolitionist agenda, and sometimes crime requires being punished. And I say this because in Latin America, the absence of the state has led to impunity, to financial crimes, corruption, vigilantism, homicide, violence against women, for example. So in conclusion, state institutions can be a site of political and social struggle, where state agents promote and advance organizational change towards the protection of individuals' rights. The activist and the research agenda require exploring the influence of background and professional trajectories. So who are these state bureaucrats? What did they study? How are they trained? What are their emotions? And we have to determine their commitments and performance with service provision. We also have to assess our capacity and the capacity of social movements and organizations like LEASUR to influence the operation of state bureaucrats and include their emotions, motivations, and commitments in our agenda. Thank you.
Next up, Valeria.
Can you hear me well? No? My name is Valerio. I am going to present on a paper that's a joint work with Bob Apel, who's also a faculty member here at Rutgers. Some of you might know him from his passionate debates with economists on Twitter. If you don't, check it out. I'm originally from Croatia, so it's very exciting to be here at an international conference. And I would like to thank Andres for putting it together and all of you for coming from far away. So,
We're trying to figure out what to do. Okay. Oh, did you say next? Then we'll work. Okay, maybe it will work. Oh, it works.
So, Bob and I have a paper where we looked at how police contact is related to health across Europe. And then when Andres was putting together this conference, we thought of maybe looking at ways in which we could examine our data by considering within Europe divisions between what we called, I guess, the core and periphery. So this paper really is about, or this is a very, I wouldn't call it a paper, preliminary analysis that looks at to what extent there are differences in the quantity and quality of police contact across Europe, especially between really post-communist countries and Western democracies, and at the same time look at whether there are any effects of police contact on health and well-being. So this research question really hinges on the idea of proactive policing. And some of you are familiar with this notion. Proactive policing has really become a dominant form of law enforcement in the US and an influential model globally. Clearly, as Michael's presentation shows, in Mexico, proactive policing seems to be very common. The central idea in this model is the focus on crime prevention and public safety improvements through direct community engagement. And what that means in practice is that police officers more frequently and more regularly interact with members of the public. So that's in contrast to a more traditional model where police was expected more to respond to crime that's happening. I don't have a lot of time to get into the differences, the details of the differences between, I guess, the Western democracies in Europe, or traditional Western democracies, and post-communist countries, but I'll just point out some of the reasons why we think that policing in post-communist countries is different from policing in the West. During communist times, police really served as the sword of the revolution, and the law was subordinated to regime survival. And some of the aspects of that traditional aspects of policing survive today in the form of, to some extent, a lack of restraint among law enforcement in terms of the way they interact with the public, in part because oftentimes officers from the communist era have remained in law enforcement, oftentimes taking on high-ranking positions. The other reason is that there is an inherited mistrust among members of the public. And that's largely because during communist times, the secret police had an unchecked power and people did not feel they could trust law enforcement. And some of that fear and mistrust has spilled over decades afterward at times of post-communist times. And finally, thank you. Finally, there's just another list of reasons or aspects of the way that traditionally policing in communist times has affected policing in post-communist era. Some of those include politicization of police, corruption clearly is a big issue in post-communist countries, deprofessionalization, as well as ethnic divisions and militarization of police in post-conflict European societies. This is not all the post-communist countries, but especially countries in former Yugoslavia. Okay, so as you can imagine, because of all these reasons, the way the public interacts with police and law enforcement in post-communist countries might really be very different from the way people in Western democracies interact with law And because of that, what we expected to find, in a sense, is that, well, the public in post-communist countries or the periphery countries might be more reluctant to be in contact with police, and perhaps those interactions might be less successful or satisfactory. And we also kind of, I guess, expected that once people do interact with police, that those interactions will have kind of adverse impact on their health and well-being. But why look at the impact of policing in general? For criminologists, the procedural justice theory, and Michael talked about it as well, it's a very powerful and important theory that basically forces us to think about the way police-public interactions have consequences for shaping, especially public opinion about the criminal justice system. When policing practices are procedurally just, and that means fair, ethical, and respectful treatment of police officers in their interactions with the public, these practices can lead to higher levels of trust and confidence in the police. When procedurally just policing happens, the positive outcomes can include an enhanced sense of public safety, and trust in law enforcement, and a greater legitimacy in the eyes of the public. What's very interesting is that when the interactions are not perceived as just, when they're unsatisfactory, the impact that has on the public is even greater than the interactions that are considered satisfactory. And some of these outcomes of bad interactions, I guess, could include the public being less inclined to cooperate with police and law enforcement, and that means there will be greater potential for confrontation. In our analysis, we were kind of among the first to look at ways in which police-public interactions can affect other aspects of, rather than just public opinion about law enforcement. So we wanted to see, based on a little bit of research that's been happening in the US, whether police-public interactions have any associations or correlations with indicators of health and well-being. And essentially, there could be kind of two ways to think why, or the mechanisms through which police-public interactions affect, or police practices affect public well-being. One of them is that interactions that are accompanied by threats or discriminatory retort may act as a stressor that can lead to emotional and psychological harm. In his fascinating ethnography of Paris, Didier Fassin documented a range of insults that police officers use in their interactions with local youth, especially youth of color. And that seems to be a pretty standard practice, not only in France, Paris, but also other countries, including countries in Eastern Europe. The other more obvious reason how policing can affect health and well-being is by interactions involving physical use of force or use of physical force. And this can range from minor forms of physical contact, such as body searches, to severe beatings and house invasions. So this can clearly lead to physical injury and disabilities among people who experience these types of interactions. But I think it's also important to be mindful of the fact that these types of experiences also have an impact on psychological and emotional well-being of people who experience them. And Didier Fassin described that well when he said that violence affects the integrity and dignity of individuals, and not just their body and flesh. So in this study, we used data from the European Social Survey. In 2010, there was a justice module that was implemented and collected a lot of information about aspects of procedural justice, including contact with law enforcement. 27 countries were included. We looked at 26, excluding Israel. And European Social Survey is probably the best cross-national European survey. It's been happening since 2002, every 2 years. And the samples are nationally representative. They range in size from about 1,000 in Cyprus to about 3,000 in Germany. And this is all for the 2010 data collection. target response rate for the surveys was 70%, but the actual response rates ranged from about 31% in Germany to about 81% in Bulgaria. I don't know why Bulgarians love to fill out surveys, but that's maybe a research question for the future. And the data were collected using face-to-face interviews in participants' homes. Okay, so there's different ways you can split countries in Europe, I guess, into core versus periphery. What we did is we looked at two classifications that were published. We looked at their basis was income to make this distinction between core and periphery countries. But we also find that actually they line up well with our notion of, with our focus on policing, because it turns out that basically all the countries in the periphery are post-communist countries. And almost all of the countries, except I guess Greece and Portugal, the countries in the south, in the core, are kind of established Western democracies. So I can read this. Scandinavian countries include Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, I think, in this data. Okay. So in our analysis, we looked at three outcomes or dependent variables that indicate health and well-being. The first one is based on a very popular common measure of overall health that's based on asking people, how would you rate your health overall currently? And the measure ranges from poor to excellent on a 5-point scale. What we did and what people do most of the time is we made a binary variable that distinguishes between people who classify their health as poor or fair versus people who classify their health as fair, good, or excellent. The other measure was based on asking people if they have any functional limitations that hamper daily activities. This was also a binary yes-no measure. It does mainly include physical aspects of health, but also may include some aspects of mental health as well. And the final measure was a WHO emotional well-being index that was based on 3 items that I just don't remember anymore what they are. Five. Makes sense.
5 minutes, sorry.
Oh, 5 minutes. Thank you, Bob. Yes. Okay. 5 minutes, 3 items.
We got time.
Good. Okay. So we measure quantity of police contact by asking people. We didn't ask people, but by looking at a question that asked people in the past 2 years, did the police approach you, stop you, or make contact with you for any reason? And this is a measure of police-initiated contact, so it doesn't really include people asking or calling the police for help. We assessed the quality of contact for people who have experienced it over the past few years by using a measure based on the question, how dissatisfied or satisfied were you with the way the police treated you the last time this happened? And this measure or responses ranged from 0 to 4 on a scale from very dissatisfied to very satisfied. We have controlled for a few things in our regression models. Individual level controls include age, gender, ethnic minority status, citizenship, education, income. And in our original paper, we also performed multi-level analysis where we controlled for country level covariance as well. Right. So our analysis kind of answers two or questions or describes two things. The first one is the prevalence of police-initiated contact in each country and the satisfaction with police contact when it happens. And the second one is based on multiple regression, and it shows the magnitude of the association between police contact and our 3 indicators of health and well-being. All right, so it's going to be a set of 5 figures. The first figure shows the prevalence of police contact in these 26 countries. Okay, so the y-axis is simply the average proportion of people in each country who have reported having contact with police over the past 2 years. And what you can see here, and it's not a very clear pattern, but it does seem that for the most part, countries in the core of Europe seem to be, that's where most of the contact seems to happen. For instance, the top 5 countries in terms of prevalence of contact are all Northern European countries, Finland, Sweden, Belgium, Switzerland, Netherlands. In Bulgaria, they love to fill out surveys, but they don't like to be contacted by police, I guess. So the prevalence is extremely low. It's about 15%. In terms of satisfaction with contact, the pattern is a little more clear. Out of the 10 countries where satisfaction was the highest, 9 of those countries are from the core of Europe. And the only country that kind of stands out is Estonia, where people seem to be fairly satisfied with police contact when it happens. The next figures show the correlation basically between police contact and health outcomes. The first one looks at the indicator of poor health, and the horizontal line is at 0, and when the confidence intervals cross that line, that means that the association is not statistically significant. What you see here is in most countries, there is no association with overall health, except for the 5 countries to the right, where it seems that police contact is associated with worse health. All of these countries are countries in the core of Europe, I guess. Except for the Czech Republic, where it seems that experience of police contact is related to better health. I will not read too much into it because it doesn't fit my narrative. The second outcome is functional limitations, and here, similarly, in most countries, there doesn't seem to be an association, and for countries where there is an association, it's always negative. In other words, police contact is related to work, to being more likely to have functional limitations. But there does not seem to be a whole lot of pattern in terms of core versus periphery. And finally, the 3-item scale of emotional well-being. Again, for most countries, there is no association between police contact and emotional well-being. But when it happens, it tends to be negative. In other words, police contact seems to be associated with less emotional well-being. And there's a little bit more of a pattern here in the sense that countries in the core, that's where we see these harmful effects of police contact the most. All right, so to summarize, what we find is that police contact is less common in the European periphery, and this essentially means it's less common in post-communist countries. And when it happens in the periphery, people don't seem to like it that much. But what we didn't necessarily expect is that when there are adverse implications for health, that tends to happen in the core countries. And you might ask yourself why. One of the explanations that might make sense is that people in the core countries enter these interactions with maybe expectations of a fair and respectful treatment compared to countries in post-communist parts of Europe where people don't necessarily expect a whole lot from police. And I can say that from my experience as being a Croatian in the 90s, at least with the last people I wanted to have anything to do with. So in that sense, you know, when an interaction kind of disappoints, that might have more of an impact on an individual than when you walk into an interaction not expecting much to begin with. It's a question for future research, probably that would require some kind of original data collection. There are limitations of our analysis. One of them is that we can't really claim causal effects, I guess, because the causal arrow may point in each direction. In other words, people who are in poor health might be more likely contacted with police, and this especially applies for people with mental health problems. And the second is more of a limitation in the sense of understanding these findings. So we don't really know anything about the nature of the interaction. We don't know if violence was involved or anything else, which really limits our ability to understand what's going on. I think today, looking at Europe and policing is more important than ever because of the refugee crisis. And in both Eastern, Central, and Western European countries, police is taking on an increasing role in enforcing immigration laws, which really open a lot of space for confrontation, especially knowing all that we know about the racial biases that people bring into policing in the US, but also in Europe. Thank you very much.
Next, Mila from the Saatchi Foundation.
Is this on? Can you hear me okay? Hi. Thank you very much for the Rutgers University School of Criminal Justice, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for hosting us. This has been already a really riveting morning. And thank you as well to Isabel and Valerio for your presentations. Just thrilled to be here. My name is Mila Cherechina from the Open Society Foundations. I'm the advisor to the president in our executive office and have the pleasure to contribute to coordinating a number of initiatives that are led by exceptional colleagues across the network. One of those exceptional colleagues is Eloisa Griggs, who's in the audience and you'll be hearing from a little bit later today. She's the Deputy Director of our Latin America programming. One of the great things for me is that despite the work that we do as the second largest philanthropy in the world, the largest funder of human rights work, present in most countries globally and physically with offices in some 44 countries. The good thing is you're not going to hear me give you a survey of all of our work, but you'll get to hear a little bit more in depth from Eloisa later. My goal really is just to open it up to you as soon as possible and just give you some reflections that were sparked by what we heard from our presenters. This morning, the session just before this one was called Observation, and the session that we're in right now is called Intervention. So we moved from sort of watching the system to considering what it means to intervene in it. And it's a conversation that we're having ourselves at the Open Society Foundations, and so I'm finding this session a really helpful rumination for our own conversations internally. Isabel, you mentioned some really interesting phrases this morning that really stuck with me. You asked, how do I reconcile my role as an activist alongside my role as a scholar? You asked, how do successful alliances between civil society and governments form? And you asked, how does one be perceived as not having simply an abolitionist agenda, but a constructive agenda? And it's something that we at the Open Society Foundations are grappling with in an initiative called Securing Open Societies that several of you in the room have interacted with. And it's an effort to figure out how can an organization that espouses human rights and advocacy and is activist at the same time find constructive spaces to engage with government officials, with government agencies, and it's a vision that we're trying to pursue because it's an organization that values a diversity of approaches and sees that a diversity of approaches are perhaps the best way to achieve reform, and perhaps the best way to acknowledge that security and safety is valid, but likewise freedoms, human rights, open society values are valid. So one of the things my brain did as I was listening to you speak is I was trying to think about the wider field of public health approaches to justice, a field that takes into account a person's overall well-being as being something that's very deeply intertwined with the safety of their environment, how they experience it, the likelihood of contact with law enforcement. And I kind of was thinking of a typology of where this field seems to lie. And there seems to be one element where, I guess the typology of where interventions are possible. At one end of the scale, you have the possibility of affecting the environment. Then somewhere in the middle, you have the possibility of affecting the moment of contact. And then somewhere at the other end, you have the possibility of affecting the form that punishment or, let's say, treatment might take. Rebecca McHugh, who was originally meant to be joining us as part of this panel, was going to be giving us an example of some of these community-based environmental interventions. How do you engage youth to be moved from a life of engagement in organized gangs and drug use to be sort of more effectively engaged in sport and in other community activities, with some of the examples that she was going to allude to. And it reminds me of some of the work that OSF has done around community policing and around funding police associations and unions to have a more productive and collaborative relationship with the community rather than just a policing relationship to the community. And so there's something about this kind of public health approach that it's about the environment. And then there's something about the public health approach that's about the moment of contact, which Valerio was really digging into in his research that he conducted with Robert. How do we think about the moment at which law enforcement interacts with the community, and what does that moment of contact do to that person's health and well-being, or what health and well-being do they bring as a predisposition, if you will, to that interaction. It reminds me of some of the work that OSF supports around racial profiling and police contacts, both in the US and in Europe. And then there's the space of kind of the resulting treatment or the resulting punishment, and what kind of interventions make sense to improve that interaction. Isabel pointed to some really fascinating examples of kind of methods of governance as an intervention, a kind of collaboration, if you will, between the incarcerated and the incarcerator. And this kind of space of public health that's around the resulting treatment really reminds me of some of the work that OSF does to support harm reduction initiatives that change the way law enforcement relates, especially to drug users. So I'm wondering, just taking the language that Andres and others have formulated for this conference, I'm wondering at what point in those three is it most important to create knowledge, to build community, and to push for reform, to use the trifecta in the subtitle? Where have you seen the most promising effects happen? Where have you seen the best research or the most promising interventions happen? So sort of second set of questions that came up for me as I was listening to you speak is, there are differences in who we can claim is responsible for the intervention, or the degree to which we think about a person's well-being and health in the course of the criminal justice system. Valerio was speaking about the responsibility of the police themselves in that context. We can think about the responsibility of community and civil society groups, something that OSF really thinks about. And we can also think about the responsibility of the self, which Isabella alludes to. Sort of what do those who are imprisoned actually have as a responsibility to design interventions? There also, the third sort of line of questioning for me was, well, there are different implications in what we heard today about the length of commitment that one must invest when it comes to an intervention. For Valerio's case, when he's thinking about that moment of police contact, that moment when someone is stopped and searched, that's sort of a one-off responsibility to change one's practices and to think about one's relationship to the community. In Isabella's case, as she's talking about incarceration, she's thinking about the term of incarceration. So it's sort of a longer, more, let's say a medium term of responsibility, but it's sort of time-bound in a particular space. And then there's also the question of the long-run interventions. If one's trying to change the environment, if one's trying to change the relationship that people have to the space that they occupy, the opportunities they have, the health they can anticipate. That's a sort of really different length of commitment, I guess, that's implied there. And the final sort of questions that came up for me is, who do we think of as being responsible for the evaluation and the analysis and the assessment of the quality of these interventions? Among school, some of our colleagues who are here from the Global Justice Lab like to use the term co-production. So And Isabel also alluded to this idea of how can one constructively engage with government officials. So is that the best way to produce knowledge about what's happening? Sort of researchers working with civil society, with government officials. And when we think about responsibility for evaluation, is that about evaluating after the effect? So a little bit like Valeria's work, after the contact has happened. Is it about accompanying it during, the way some of our colleagues this morning thinking about observation were describing? And at what point should that cycle of feedback to policymakers occur as a result? The final set of observations I wanted to share with you that was sparked for me in the conversation we just heard from Valeria and Isabel is just to turn the lens on the global south. It's such a vague term. You know, I'm someone who, like Valeria, comes from former Yugoslavia. I grew up in Australia, and here I am living in the US, and so my conception of North and South and the meanings of the first and second and third world have really been turned all sorts of different directions and sideways and diagonally. But just interesting to think about, you know, Europe versus sort of former Soviet or former Yugoslav states, to think about the BRICS versus other parts of the third world. So as we're thinking about these interventions, really kind of going more granularly than Global South and thinking about what we're learning from the different constituent elements of what it means to be Global South. Valeria's paper touched on issues of core and periphery, and I just wanted to push us to think about how interventions at the core of a country versus the periphery of a country really differ. So what we do in cities and the kind of main cosmopolitan, metropolitan areas versus what we do perhaps even in border areas or more remote areas. What a government gets away with at its peripheries where people don't see can have really troubling trickle-over and spillover effects into broader policies. And so just thinking about the core and periphery and interventions was really sparked for me by your presentation, Valerio. And then finally, just, you know, like many of you, was grabbed by the global warming report from the ICC that came out recently. And as we think about health and its interaction with criminal justice, and as we think about interventions, what will the future of more and more extreme stresses on our environment mean for the way in which people experience health, the kind of well-being that they're able to hold on to, the sort of environment that they're able to enjoy, particularly in the global south, and then what it will mean for the kind of security responses that we see developing. Anyway, I've taken us on a very broad tour, but I wanted to open up and share with you what these excellent presentations this morning sparked for me. Thank you.
At this moment, we'll have a 10-minute Q&A session. So just raise your hands and we'll be passing the mics around.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. I have one comment and question to Isabel and a couple of questions to Valerio. To Isabel, I agree with you that in the case of Latin America, we have to consider closely these kind of experiments that in the field of criminal justice can produce alternatives to the traditional way of working of our criminal justice institutions, producing huge levels of harm, inequality, injustice. And I was wondering if you are considering making an empirical study of this kind of involvement of public defense lawyers, but also activists in legal systems inside prisons in Chile, because this is a common phenomenon also in other countries, for example in Argentina. And I think there is a field of intervention there that is very, very interesting, and nobody is watching it very closely. And I think it's a very interesting example of involvement that could be in some way understood better, and also can be replicated in other contexts. And to Valerio, I really appreciate your presentation. It's very, very interesting. I was wondering if in the European Social Survey, the contacts that were considered between police officers and citizens are only contacts initiated by police officers, or also contacts initiated by citizens? Because it's a very interesting, other way of considering the relationship between police officers and citizens and the impact and the levels of satisfaction, but also the levels of trust and legitimacy. And I also want to ask you if there are other, empirical studies, surveys done in post-communist Europe about police-citizens encounters, using surveys particularly, that in some way try to understand also this other dimension of contacts between citizens and police officers. And the last is, what do you think about the way of measuring well-being by the European Social Survey? Because as we know, it's a very complex concept, and how it is translated in a survey, it's of course debatable.
My question is actually connected to to Maximo's last question for Valerio. I'm wondering about sort of your thoughts on the limitations of that data source and how people are defining well-being, like self-well-being, right? So especially given the shift in refugee resettlement in other countries, this notion of, for example, trauma or depression or generalized anxiety, that those terms are very Western terms and might not necessarily register within the context of the folks that are taking this survey. So I'm wondering if those are sort of some of the limitations that you also notice.
La pregunta para Isabel. Hola. La pregunta es sobre el caso chileno. Quizás excede un poco tu presentación, pero hay unos datos que quizás podemos compartir de tu experiencia o conocimiento del caso, tratar de discutir. En términos generales hay información sobre un declive importante de las tasas de encarcelamiento en los últimos años. Desde el año 2010 al año 2016 hay una baja, según los informes que pude tener a la vista, de 320 detenidos cada 100.000 habitantes, 245. Y los informes de estadísticas de la Corte Suprema refieren, digamos, como algún intento explicativo, digamos, muy general, la aprobación de una ley en el año 2013 que se orienta a la aplicación de las medidas sustitutivas, y además se hace referencia a la utilización más frecuente del régimen semiabierto. Parece que este tipo de explicación, que se asienta exclusivamente sobre la reforma legal como motor del cambio, siempre es sospechosa de insuficiente. Entonces te quería preguntar a ver qué otras circunstancias o qué otras modificaciones en políticas públicas, en la acción de los tribunales, o incluso en la motorización de intervenciones desde afuera, que han podido lograr algún tipo de cambio y que, digamos, se proyecten sobre esta baja que después de 10 años de crecimiento exponencial se muestra en muy poco tiempo, 6 años, como sustantiva, una baja muy sustantiva.
I'm asking. When you have no authority so my first question is to Isabel. I wonder about the kind of like class and family backgrounds of these officials, because usually, so I ethnography among the state officials in Turkey and the police, and those who usually sympathize with, for instance, like the citizens are actually coming from lower class backgrounds or same like ethnic racial profile. And I also wonder, do they have any kind of like incentive to do this kind of work in terms of their like work satisfaction or something? So you usually, for instance, in Turkey or in other places, those kind of officers get punished by the higher ranking like kind of like authorities because of doing such kind of caring work. And the second question, I really appreciate there's always like caring bureaucracies kind of conceptualization but also I am cynical about the issue of like caring, because so you mentioned about the guard, prison guard who said that Juan doesn't belong here. Please, Isabel, help him. But he also thinks that some of them do belong to prison. So when you introduce this like caring concept, there's also this like those who are deserving to be cared and those who are not deserving to care. So I want you to kind of reflect on that with Valeria, and actually you already listed that as a kind of limitation of the research about finding, not finding like direct correlation between like public health and like well-being, with well-being and the police contact. And also I very much want to second her point, Ashley's point about like it is really hard to like quantify like well-being, and it is really so how like with this kind of studies, how are you go beyond this kind of like very Western-centered quantification of the well-being, which and this also like brings back to Mila's point of like public health approach, like environmental intervention approach, the kinds of like community policing projects that I observed in Turkey, for instance, employ this kind of community intervention, environmental intervention projects for the youth, for instance, but they usually ended up policing the environment and social relations of these youth. So at one point, like every aspect of their life, their education, health, well-being, then they got securitized, and so there's this risk of like over-policing when you do it for kind of for better policing. So it would be great if you kind of comment on this limitation.
Hi, thank you for two very interesting presentations. I'm just, maybe this is a bit of a weird way of trying to tie together your comments at the end and Isabel's presentation. In terms of when there are these systems that aren't working very well in terms of the formal institutional actors, and particularly, as we saw before on pretrial detention, everything that happens inside other actors, whether they're prisoner leaders or NGOs such as yours or individual officials, how do you think that we can translate that into thinking about tracking changes and who gets credit for when something is getting better? Some would attribute all of the bad things to the government, all of the good things to informal actors, or vice versa, and it's very hard to kind of disaggregate what is happening because of these unofficial interventions and what is happening at a more systemic level, and when are these actors actually just filling in the gaps for what the formal government should be doing, and particularly with regard to prosecutors who, at least from what I've seen in prisoner cases and complaints, seem to be the ones that are most at fault for some of these problems.
I have one question too. Okay. I know that every time a quantitative paper is presented, they ask for controls. So I wanted to ask you if you controlled by the number of policemen or citizens in the countries. Because I assume that the bigger the police force, right, the more likely are citizens to interact with the police.
We have actually, Bob has found the measures, so we will, this paper has been under revision for 6 months. If we ever get it back, we will add that into our model. Thank you. Good point. Sure?
Yes.
How much time do we have?
10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes, okay. Wow.
So 3 minutes.
So I would like to thank Mila for, this is basically, so much stuff to think about. I really appreciate it. I'll thank everybody for their questions. I'll just maybe choose questions that I can answer within 3 minutes, kind of. So first of all, there's very little data in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, about policing in general. And there's really no data that's been collected with the notion of understanding the extent to which police contact affects people's well-being. And the ESS, the European Social Survey, the 2010 Justice Module, was created with the idea of understanding procedural justice issues within Europe. So their focus was really the kind of the traditional focus of procedural justice, which is understanding trust and confidence in law enforcement, and those kinds of things. So mainly public opinion about law enforcement. We were fortunate enough that ESS asks a set of health questions basically every year or every time it's fielded. So we didn't really get to choose the health questions, and we just went along with whatever they had. And I think in terms of how to measure health outcomes, it's certainly not straightforward, but I think these measures are simple enough that I think in general they probably allow people from different backgrounds to give us some sense of how they feel or the kinds of health experiences that they have. So I think it's very important moving forward to kind of really be thinking about policing and public health more generally, especially in Eastern and also Western Europe. Related to that, one other point I wanted to make is that I think basically this whole criminal justice is largely about researching criminal justice. It's largely about identifying different ways in which the criminal justice system affects different aspects of people's well-being. Is it employment, housing, health, and so on? And I think for too often we design criminal justice policies and policing practices with only kind of the law enforcement in mind. When I think moving forward, we need to take into account that criminal justice affects people in these different ways, and we need to be building these policies with that in mind. I don't think that's happening. There's a little bit of, in public health, there's a call here and there, let's work together, let's figure things out, but I don't think there's anything systematically being taking place. There's always other questions, but I'll hand it over. Thank you now.
Thanks for your questions. They're very, very challenging but interesting. About the decline of the prison rates in Chile, that's right. And part of my guess is that there's been a change in the paradigm towards mass supervision, just like it has happened here in the US. But also, this happened under the government of Sebastián Piñera, who is a right-wing politician in Chile. So that means, or that has been explained with the idea that right-wing politicians have more legitimacy to be merciful, to give mercy, or to appear as generous with inmates. So because they were tough on crime during the 90s, now they have the image that they were already tough on crime, and now they can be open to alternatives. So that's one way of explaining it. About my fieldwork, yes. I'm starting my fieldwork in 2019. One of my options is being an intern of a public defender or becoming a public defender within the prison myself. So I'll let you know how it goes. I need to get the IRB approval for that, but it's going native. That's my purpose. About the sympathy and the background of correctional officers, yes, I found the same. They all come from lower classes, usually from rural areas. So their class backgrounds probably has to be with this kind of connection and empathy with prisoners. And you're skeptical about carrying bureaucracies. I am too. But I think that it's a good framework, and it's a good goal, and it's a good framework to have in mind how do we want to approach the penal state. And you're right. People make a distinction between the deserving and the serving. But this case of the prison guard that wanted to help one of the inmates, the inmate was a sexual molester. So there is a type of ambiguity there. Like every inmate deserves respect, and the idea that we have, that we make distinctions among criminal offenders. So it seems that the boundaries within prisons are less clear than outside. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Like we make like huge distinction between type of crimes, but in prison it doesn't have to be that way necessarily. About tracking changes and who gets credit. I think that as an activist, I stopped asking that question for me, because we've had I think that we've had a lot of successes, but people say, no, it wasn't you. It wasn't your organization. It was like this, A, B, and C. And well, I started thinking that we were all of us involved in that change. But as a scholar, I agree with you. We need to track changes. And I think that research, even this kind of opportunities to exchange information and to exchange experiences, like court watch, that's amazing. That's like something so powerful that we're sharing that knowledge. So yeah, I think that court watch, that's my goal. I'm gonna tell people from LEASUR that we have to do it. And yeah, to your comment about creating respect, I think that's possible to create respect with, as you were saying, with alliances between civil society and government officials. I'm very optimistic in that sense.
Thank you. The only comment I wanted to contribute was just the questions that have come up about well-being and some of these other measures that have their challenges. Something Andres said in the introduction to today's proceedings was that one opportunity we have here is to challenge the notion that the Global South is data poor and there is an absence of data. And I think already in these first couple of sessions we've seen a richness and a diversity of ways to use data that the government would be familiar with, like the European survey you're working with, as well as unusual sources of data such as observation that some of you in the room are working with. So thank you for already beginning to demonstrate that proof of concept.
Thank you for the questions and answers. At this moment, we'll break for lunch, and then there's many places to eat around the campus, and we'll meet back here at 1:30.